He was just the janitor. Nobody looked at him. Nobody knew his name. Every morning he arrived before the city woke up, moving through the glass corridors of a 42-floor empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, an empire he was never meant to be part of. Then one morning, he picked up a piece of paper someone had left behind. 2 seconds. That was all it took. Within minutes, he was escorted out of the building in front of everyone, fired, humiliated, erased. But the moment he walked out those doors, the entire company started falling apart, because the man they had just thrown out onto the street was the only person who could save them. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching from. Let me see how far this story travels. The cleaning cart had a bad wheel. It had been bad for 3 weeks, pulling slightly left every time Adrian Cole pushed it down the corridor, and he'd learned to correct for it the way a person learns to walk with a limp, not consciously anymore, just automatically, the body absorbing the inconvenience and filing it away somewhere beneath thought. He angled his weight to the right. The cart tracked straight. Problem managed. That was how Adrian operated, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. It was 4:47 in the morning when he turned the corner onto the 41st floor of the Asterian Group building, and the city of Chicago was still mostly dark below the windows. He could see it from the corridor, that long, unbroken view of Lake Michigan going flat and gray toward the horizon, the office towers along the loop still lit from inside, the pre-dawn light beginning to dissolve the edge between the water and the sky. It was the kind of view that cost $1,000 a square foot, and Adrian saw it every morning before anyone who paid for it was even awake. He didn't think about that. Or if he did, he thought about it the way you think about weather, noted, acknowledged, and then set aside. The 41st floor was the creative division. He knew each floor by feel after 8 months, which ones smelled like takeout containers left too long in trash cans, which ones had the fluorescent panel in the northeast corner that buzzed faintly when the HVAC was running, which ones the security cameras covered completely, and which had that dead angle behind the server closet near the stairwell. He knew the 41st floor had plants that were always shedding, some kind of tall tropical thing near the reception desk that dropped long yellowed leaves in a slow continuous cycle, and he picked them up 3 mornings a week without being asked because nobody else did, and they accumulated fast. He started at the far end, the way he always did, moving through the open creative bullpen with its rows of wide drafting tables and oversized monitors. The space was different from the finance floors, which were all cubicles and locked drawer cabinets, and the slightly antiseptic smell of people who kept their workspaces aggressively neutral. The creative floor had tack boards pinned with printouts and color swatches. There were coffee rings on almost every flat surface. Someone had stuck a hand-drawn caricature of what appeared to be a very frustrated art director to the side of the communal printer, and it had been there long enough that the tape had yellowed at the corners. Adrian collected the trash, sprayed and wiped the countertops, moved chairs back to their default positions beneath the tables. He worked the way water moves, finding the path of least friction, filling in what needed to be filled in, not calling attention to itself. He had been a different kind of person, once. He didn't spend much time thinking about that either. By 5:15, he'd worked his way through the main bullpen and into the annex, a quieter section of the floor that housed the senior creative staff. Fewer people, larger desks, the kind of chairs that adjusted 12 different ways and cost more than his monthly rent. The offices along the far wall had glass fronts with fabric blinds that the occupants could close for privacy, but most of them were open this time of morning. The office at the end belonged to Darren Cross. Adrian had no particular feelings about Darren Cross. He was aware of him the way he was aware of most of the people whose spaces he cleaned, through the residue they left behind. Darren's desk was almost always clear, which was unusual for a creative director. Most of them were buried in material. Darren's surface was kept deliberately bare, just a laptop stand, a wireless keyboard, a cup of pens that looked like they'd never been used. It gave the impression of control, of a mind that kept everything important somewhere else. What Adrian had noticed, not that he cataloged these things intentionally, but that his eyes moved over spaces the way a proofreader's eyes moved over text, catching discrepancies without meaning to, was that Darren's trash was always emptied before Adrian arrived, which meant someone was emptying it at night or Darren was doing it himself. That was unusual enough to register, in the same low-level background way that the bad wheel on the cart registered, noted, filed, not examined further. He moved past Darren's office and into the short hallway that connected the annex to the secondary conference room. A smaller space than the main boardroom, but heavily used by the creative team for working sessions. The table inside was long and pale, a kind of bleached ash wood, and this morning it had not been fully cleared from whatever session had run late the night before. There were 2 coffee cups, a stack of printed reference images, face down, a mechanical pencil with the lead broken off sitting at the edge of the table like it had been set down in frustration and forgotten. And on the near end of the table, partially slid beneath a manila folder, a single sheet of heavy cardstock. Adrian picked it up automatically, the way he picked up everything that didn't belong. The same motion he'd use for a dropped pen or a stray napkin. He set it face up on the stack of reference images, intending to leave it in a neat pile where whoever had forgotten it could find it easily. He didn't study it. He barely looked at it. What he saw, in the 2 or 3 seconds it took him to pick it up and set it down, was that it was a design document of some kind. A page of typography samples in what looked like a proprietary font, with color swatches along one margin and a project code printed in the upper corner. It was a detailed document, the kind of thing that took weeks to produce, and it had clearly been left here by accident. He straightened the stack, collected the coffee cups, wiped the table down, and moved on. He was finished with the floor by 5:52, 8 minutes ahead of schedule. He found out he was a person of interest at 6:23 when his supervisor called him into the ground floor facilities office. The facilities office was a narrow room behind the loading dock, painted the particular institutional beige that suggested the person responsible for choosing it had no strong feelings about color or had very deliberately chosen something that couldn't offend anyone. There was a folding table, 2 chairs, a whiteboard with the month's cleaning schedule still written on it in dry erase marker, and a wall-mounted monitor that currently showed a grid of security camera feeds. Marcus Webb, his supervisor, was a heavy man in his late 50s who communicated almost entirely in short declarative sentences and who Adrian had, over 8 months, come to respect in a quiet and uncomplicated way. Marcus didn't waste words. He said what needed to be said and left space for the other person to respond. In a world full of people who filled silence with noise, Adrian found that restful. But Marcus looked uncomfortable this morning. He was standing near the monitor rather than sitting, which he usually did, and he didn't make eye contact immediately when Adrian came in. "Close the door," Marcus said. Adrian closed the door. "There's been a complaint." Marcus finally looked at him. "From upstairs." "About what?" "You were on 41 this morning." "I'm always on 41 Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday." "Yeah." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "Someone flagged the security footage. Conference room B. You picked up a document." Adrian waited. "The document is sensitive. It's connected to a project." Marcus looked like he was choosing words the way someone chooses footing on uncertain ground. "I need to ask you directly. Did you read it? Take a photo of it? Remove it?" "No." Adrian said it without hesitation, without heat. "I picked it up off the table and put it on top of the stack. It was 2 seconds." "I believe you," Marcus said, and he said it in a way that made Adrian understand the problem wasn't whether Marcus believed him. "But the complaint didn't come to me first. It went to HR. And from HR, it went to—" He paused. "It went high. The CEO's office." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Okay. They want you off the building roster, effective immediately." There it was. Adrian didn't say anything right away. He stood in the institutional beige room and looked at the grid of security camera feeds on the monitor and thought about the bad wheel on the cleaning cart, about the 41 floors he knew by feel, about the way the lake looked at 4:47 in the morning when the light wasn't quite day and wasn't quite night. "I didn't do anything," he said. "Not angry, just clear." "I know that." But Marcus looked genuinely sorry, which Adrian appreciated and also understood meant nothing in this particular context. "I'm going to document this accurately. I'm going to say you were cooperative and there's no evidence of any—" "It's fine," Adrian said. "It's not fine." "No," Adrian agreed. "But it is what it is." He handed Marcus his badge and his key card and the small folding knife he used to break down cardboard boxes, and Marcus took them without ceremony because ceremony would have made it worse. They shook hands. Adrian took his jacket from the hook behind the door and walked out through the loading dock into the early morning air, which was cold and damp and smelled faintly of the lake, And that was that. 8 months. Gone before the city was fully awake. He took the blue line home because he always took the blue line, and sitting in the nearly empty car as it ran west through the tunnel, he let himself think about it in the specific, structured way he'd trained himself to think about things that upset him. Not suppressing the feeling, just not letting it get ahead of the facts. The facts were, he had picked up a piece of paper. He had not read it, photographed it, or taken it anywhere. He had been doing his job. Someone had looked at the security camera feed and decided that the image of a black man in a gray uniform touching an important document was a threat rather than a coincidence. He knew that wasn't the whole story, knew that wasn't necessarily the conscious thought process of whoever had flagged it. People rarely narrated their own biases to themselves. They just felt uneasy, and then they acted on the unease, and then they told themselves the action was reasonable. That didn't make it less true. He stared at the window, where his reflection looked back at him overlaid against the dark tunnel wall. 37 years old. A face that had aged in the places that faces aged when they carried weight over a long period of time. Not deeply lined, but settled. Settled in a way that was different from tired. He looked like a man who had made a series of decisions about what kind of life he was going to live and was living it with his eyes open. He thought about his apartment on Kedzie, which was small and clean and organized the way only a person who'd lived in chaos could organize a space, with the absolute minimum of things, each object earning its place. He thought about his Tuesday evening drawing class at the community center on Milwaukee Avenue, which he'd been attending for 6 weeks and which nobody who knew him from a Styrian group would ever have guessed about. He thought about all of it, and then he thought, what now? Not a question, just a state of being. His name was not Adrian Cole. Well, it was, now. It had been, legally, for 6 years. But before that, in the industry, he'd gone by A.J. Coleman. And A.J. Coleman had been something. Not famous, not in the way of people whose names ended up on award show screens or magazine covers, but known. Known in the specific, dense way that creative people become known within their own world. A reputation built on work rather than visibility, which was both its strength and the reason it evaporated so cleanly when he chose to walk away. He had been a senior brand strategist and identity designer for 11 years at firms whose clients were household names, technology companies, automotive brands, media organizations. He had, at his peak, led a team of 14 people and managed concurrent projects worth, in aggregate, something north of $80 million. He had a specific talent for taking a company's half-formed sense of itself and translating it into something visual and structural that outlasted trends. Identity systems that worked at every scale, from a favicon to a billboard, that were coherent without being rigid, that had room inside them for a brand to grow. He was, in the language of the industry, very good. He was also, for a period of about 2 years before he left, increasingly difficult to work with. He knew that. He didn't dispute it. Grief had done things to him. Grief and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the most competent person in every room for long enough that you start to feel the weight of it as a burden rather than a distinction. He'd made enemies. He'd missed deadlines, not because he was failing, but because he was holding everything to a standard that the clients couldn't always articulate why they needed, but that he couldn't stop himself from maintaining. He'd burned some bridges, let others rot quietly from neglect, and then Isabel had died. His younger sister, 29 years old, a complication situation that happened too fast for anyone to fully process. And whatever remaining appetite he'd had for the performance of professional ambition had simply stopped working, like a circuit that blew. Not depression, or not only depression. More like a complete reorganization of what he could spend energy on and what he couldn't. He'd walked away, changed his legal name back to what it was before he'd contracted it for professional use, found a cleaning job through a temp agency, and discovered, to his genuine surprise, that the work suited something in him. Its physicality, its clarity of purpose, the way a clean space was visibly, undeniably clean when you were done with it. No politics. No one asking him to compromise his judgment on something that mattered in order to make someone feel better about something that didn't. He'd spent 6 years becoming invisible, and he'd found, on balance, that invisible was livable. What it wasn't, apparently, was safe. Not even invisible was safe. If you were in the wrong place with the wrong piece of paper in your hand and the wrong person watching the security feed. He got off at Kedzie, walked the 4 blocks home in the cold, unlocked his apartment and stood in the kitchen for a moment, not doing anything, before he put the kettle on and sat down at the small table by the window and looked at his hands. Good hands. Steady. Always had been. Victoria Cole had not slept. This was not unusual. She had been sleeping 4 to 5 hours a night for the better part of a decade, which her doctor described as insufficient and which she described as adequate, given that the alternative, lying in the dark in her Streeterville condo thinking about everything she hadn't finished, was worse. She had developed a set of compensatory habits. She drank a specific amount of coffee at specific intervals. She kept her office cold. She took 20-minute walks at 2 p.m. regardless of weather, which her assistant had long since learned to protect on the calendar as meeting Shan external. Betty Bahawa Disposmopol. She was 51 years old, CEO of Asterion Group for 4 years, and she had spent those 4 years doing what CEOs spent their first 4 years doing: establishing authority, managing the board, cleaning up the structural problems that her predecessor had either created or ignored, and trying to build something coherent out of a company that had spent the decade before her arrival chasing market trends at the expense of identity. The irony of that, a company without a strong sense of its own identity, running a brand strategy firm, was not lost on her. She had made it part of her pitch to the board when she was being considered for the role. She had a plan for it. She was executing the plan. The Harman Media account was the linchpin, $47 million. A complete rebrand for one of the largest regional media companies in the Midwest, a company that had been through 2 failed rebrand attempts in the past decade and was, according to their own board, radioactively skeptical of outside consultants. Getting Harman had been a 3-year effort. Keeping them would require a presentation next Friday that was, by any realistic assessment, the most important thing Asterion had done in her 4 years at the helm. Darren Cross was her creative director, and he was very good at being a creative director in the ways that mattered for getting clients into a room and making them feel excited. He was charismatic, well-dressed, fast on his feet with a pitch, and had a portfolio that represented real achievement. He was also, she had come to understand over the past 18 months, someone who was extremely good at taking credit for the work of the people around him, and doing it in ways that were plausibly deniable, that looked like the normal mechanics of leadership if you weren't looking closely. She had been intending to deal with that problem after the Harman presentation. It was the kind of thing you had to time carefully. You didn't remove a creative director 6 days before the most important pitch of the fiscal year. She'd been at her desk at 6:10 a.m. when the alert came through from HR. A cleaning staff member had been caught handling sensitive design materials on the 41st floor. There was camera footage. The project materials for Harman were in that conference room. She'd watched the footage herself. She'd seen a man in a gray uniform pick up the document, hold it at an angle where he could clearly have read it, set it down. She'd called Marcus Webb's supervisor's supervisor and told them the employee needed to be removed immediately. She had not, she would acknowledge later, would acknowledge with the specific discomfort of someone who prided themselves on rigorous decision-making and had failed to apply it, asked what the employee's account was. Had not asked whether the cameras showed anything other than what she'd seen in those 15 seconds. Had not considered whether the word breach was the accurate framing for what she'd witnessed or just the most alarming available one. She'd been exhausted. She'd been under pressure. And she'd had, sitting across from her during the HR call, Darren Cross, who had arrived at her office at 6:05, before she'd even seen the alert, with a look on his face that he described as serious concern and that she had processed, in the haze of too little sleep and too much pressure, as confirmation. "I'm not making accusations," Darren had said carefully. "I just think we have to take this seriously, with everything that's at stake on Harman." She'd taken it seriously. At 6:37 a.m., she fired Adrian Cole. By 9:15 a.m., the Harman design system was gone. Gone was not quite the right word. It wasn't misplaced, wasn't corrupted through negligence or a server failure. The master files had been deleted. Not trashed. Deleted, with the kind of thoroughness that required either technical knowledge or very specific access credentials. The working backups from the previous 48 hours were also gone. The cloud sync had been disabled at some point before the deletion, which meant the offsite redundancy was 8 days old and missing 3 weeks of development work. The senior developer on the project, a quiet woman named Priya, who communicated primarily through Slack even when she was in the same room as you, discovered it when she came in to run her morning checks and found the project directory empty. She sent a single Slack message to the creative team channel that said, "Something's wrong. Get here now." Within 20 minutes, the floor was in open panic. By 10 o'clock, Victoria had been pulled from a board prep call and given a summary that she made the presenting developer repeat twice because the first time she heard it, she was certain she'd misunderstood. "The whole system," she said. "Everything past the 8-day mark. The full identity architecture, the type system, the color documentation, the grid, the component library, all of it." "How?" The developer, not Priya, but the IT security lead they'd brought in when Priya's message went up the chain, was a careful man named Greg who had the demeanor of someone who had delivered bad news before and knew that the only way through it was to be completely factual. The deletions were made using Darren Cross's credentials, his admin token, between 11:47 p.m. and 12:03 a.m. last night. Victoria looked at Greg for a long moment. "Where's Darren now?" "He came in at 8. He's in his office." She looked at the window. The lake was doing what it always did. Indifferent, enormous, going about its own business, regardless of what was happening 41 floors above it. "Get legal on the phone," she said, "and don't let him leave the building." Well, there was a particular quality to the silence in a room where powerful people have just understood that they've made a catastrophic mistake. It's not quiet in the usual sense. There are still sounds, phones going off in other offices, the HVAC, the ambient noise of a building full of people who don't yet know what's happened. But the people who know sit in something that feels, from inside it, like the silence that follows a very loud sound. Like the world is still ringing. Victoria sat in it at 10:47 a.m., in the boardroom on 42 with the legal team lead and her COO and the head of HR, and she sat very still while people talked around her and tried not to show how still she was sitting. The picture that was emerging was not simple. The investigation into the file deletion had uncovered, almost incidentally, a secondary thread, a series of internal communications sent from an email address that proxied through Darren's account, but had been set up 9 days ago, that suggested the deletion was not spontaneous, that it had been planned, that the intent had been to create a crisis at the worst possible moment, position a scapegoat, and use the resulting chaos to exit with leverage. The scapegoat had been the man in the gray uniform on the 41st floor. That part landed on Victoria with a specific physical quality. She felt it in her chest, behind the sternum, the particular sensation of understanding that you have been operated, that your judgment, which you rely on, which you have built your professional identity around, was targeted and successfully misdirected. That someone looked at your response to pressure and fear and used it against you, and you handed them the opportunity to do it. She had fired an innocent man in front of his colleagues at 6:37 in the morning. "Find out everything you can about Adrian Cole," she said, interrupting something her COO was saying about liability management. Everyone looked at her. "The cleaning staff employee, the one we—" She stopped, started again. "Find out who he is, where he is, and find out what's actually on the Harmon project that's recoverable." Her COO started to say something about the timeline and the optics of the situation and whether it was wise, and she said, with more edge than she usually let herself use in boardroom settings, "Marcus, I fired a man for touching a piece of paper while a senior member of my creative leadership was deleting $47 million of client work from our servers. We are past the point of managing optics. Find out who he is." What they found took about 40 minutes, and when the summary came back to Victoria, she read it twice. Adrian Jerome Coleman, formerly A.J. Coleman. 11 years at 3 major identity and brand design firms. A list of clients that included names she recognized from her own tenure on various industry boards. Project lead on a telecommunications rebrand in 2013 that had won 4 industry awards and been written up in 2 major design publications as a case study in intelligent system architecture. A reputation among people who'd worked with him that divided along a fairly clean line. People who said he was the best design thinker they'd worked with, and people who said he was impossible to manage if you were asking him to compromise his standards. 6 years ago, he'd left the industry following the death of his sister, changed his name back, taken cleaning work. The person who had been doing his work over the past 8 months, the person whose gray uniform and careful movements she'd watched on a 15-second security clip and interpreted as threat, had, at one point in his life, produced work that she could point to as an example of what she wanted Asterion to be doing. She set the summary down. She thought about what it would mean to call a man you'd publicly humiliated and ask him to save you. She thought about the Harmon presentation in 5 days. She thought about whether there was any other option. There wasn't. She knew there wasn't. They'd gone through the recovery options with the IT team for 2 hours, and the picture was the same every time. The 8-day-old backup was salvageable but incomplete, and rebuilding from it to a presentation-ready state in 5 days was not realistic for a team that was currently operating in crisis mode and had just lost the creative director who, whatever else he'd done, had been the one holding the conceptual framework of the project together. What they needed was someone who could look at an incomplete system and understand what it was trying to be. Who could read the logic of it and complete it coherently in the time available? Not recover it, build forward from it. That required a specific kind of mind. She looked at the phone on the table. She thought, I owe him more than a phone call, but a phone call is what I have. She picked it up. Adrian was at his kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold when his phone rang. He looked at the number. Chicago area code he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He let most things go to voicemail. But something made him answer. Maybe just the particular quality of the morning, which already had the character of a day when things were going to be different from what you expected. Is this Adrian Cole? A woman's voice. Controlled, precise. The voice of someone who had been trained to project calm and was currently working harder than usual to do it. Yes? My name is Victoria Cole. I'm the CEO of Asterion Group. A pause. I'd like to apologize to you, and then I'd like to ask you something. The apology is unconditional. The question has strings attached, and I want to be clear about that before I ask it. Adrian looked at his hands on the table, at the tea going cold, at the thin morning light coming through the window over the sink. Okay, he said. I'm listening. Yes. She told him what had happened. She didn't soften it or frame it strategically, which he would have been able to hear from across a phone call. She said, we found out what was done with the project files, and we found out who did it, and we found out that what you were accused of this morning was constructed. She said, I made a decision without enough information, and I'm responsible for that decision regardless of what I was told. She said, I know about your background. The way she said that last part was careful, not transactional, not, and therefore I need you, which would have been easier for her to say and harder for him to hear without feeling used. More like, I know I'm asking you something that requires you to trust a company that gave you no reason to trust it this morning, and I'm aware of what I'm asking. What are you asking? Adrian said. I'm asking if you'd be willing to come back to the building and look at what we have left from the Harmon project, and tell me honestly whether it's salvageable. I'm not asking you to commit to anything beyond that. Adrian was quiet for a moment. And if I say it's not salvageable, then I need to make some very different phone calls. A brief pause. But I'm hoping you'll tell me what you actually think, not what I want to hear. That's partly why I'm calling you. He thought about that. It was an odd thing to say, that's partly why I'm calling you. Odd in the way that things are odd when they're more truthful than they need to be. She wasn't selling him anything. She was stating a situation and acknowledging that it was a situation she'd created. He looked at the tea, completely cold now. I'll come look at it, he said. He didn't say, don't think this means anything. He didn't say, I'll need certain things before I commit to anything. He just said he'd come look because that was true and because he had learned the hard way, over years and grief and a long process of becoming someone quieter than he used to be, that it was better to say only what was true and leave the rest for when you knew more. Thank you, Victoria said. He hung up, stood from the table, poured the cold tea down the drain and put his jacket back on. The city was fully awake now, going about the large and different business of being a city. Somewhere on the 41st floor of a glass building downtown, a project that had taken months and millions of dollars was sitting in fragments on a server. Somewhere in that building, a man who had built something and then destroyed it was sitting in a room with lawyers. Adrian locked his apartment door and went down to the street to catch the blue line back. The morning had a long way left to go. The blue line ran east through the tunnel, and Adrian stood the whole way, one hand on the overhead bar, watching the dark wall of the tunnel pass in the window beside him. He'd taken this train in both directions more times than he could count, and it felt different going this way, back towards something instead of away from it. He wasn't sure yet if that was good or bad. He hadn't called anyone. There was no one to call, really, or no one he'd want to explain this to in the 22 minutes it took to get from Kedzie to Clark and Lake. His closest friend from his old life, a photographer named Dennis, who he still met for lunch twice a year, would have had a lot to say about it, and Adrian wasn't ready for a lot to be said. He was still in the stage where thinking about it carefully felt more useful than talking about it loudly. He thought about the phone call, about the way Victoria Cole had said I made a decision without enough information rather than we were misled or there was a miscommunication, both of which would have been softer ways of saying the same thing, and both of which would have been, in his assessment, dishonest. The fact that she'd chosen the harder phrasing told him something, not enough to trust her, but something. He thought about the word salvageable. That was a design problem, and design problems were the one category of problem he had never been able to stay away from the way he'd managed to stay away from everything else. He could stop wanting ambition. He could stop wanting recognition or money or the particular validation that came from having your name attached to something good. He could not, it turned out, stop his brain from engaging with a system that was broken and needed to be understood. He came up out of the subway into the cold and walked the 3 blocks to the Asterian building and stopped in front of the lobby doors. The building looked the same as it always did at this hour. Glass and steel going up 42 floors, the lobby visible through the front wall, 2 of the reception staff at the long desk inside who he had walked past hundreds of times without either of them learning his name or he theirs. He was wearing the same jacket he'd had on when he left. He didn't have a badge. He had no formal role here and no standing to walk in except that the CEO had asked him to. He pushed the door open and went to the desk. "My name is Adrian Cole. I'm here to see Victoria Cole." The receptionist, young woman, mid-20s, who looked like she was managing some private version of a difficult morning, typed something, looked at her screen, and then looked at him with an expression that he couldn't quite read. "I'll let her assistant know you're here." He waited near the window. 3 minutes. Then a woman in her 40s in a dark blazer came through the security door and walked straight to him with the purposeful gait of someone who had been given clear instructions. "Mr. Cole, I'm Janet, Miss Cole's executive assistant. If you'll follow me." He followed her through the security door, past reception, into the elevator bank. She pressed 42. They rode up in silence, and Adrian looked at the floor counter above the doors rather than at his own reflection in the polished metal wall. The 42nd floor was different from 41, quieter, more deliberate in its design, the kind of space that said authority without needing to say it loudly. Dark wood accents, lower light levels, doors that were solid rather than glass-fronted. He'd never cleaned up here. It was handled by a separate contractor, which he'd always found mildly interesting as a fact about how organizations structured their version of trust. Janet led him to a conference room near the end of the hall and opened the door. Victoria Cole was standing at the window. She was taller than he'd imagined from her voice. 50s, compact, with the posture of someone who had learned to take up space deliberately rather than naturally. She was wearing a dark blazer over a gray shirt, and she looked like she hadn't slept, which he suspected was normal for her but was showing more than usual today. When she turned from the window, her expression was direct in a way that he found he could work with. Not warm, exactly. Honest. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said the apology was unconditional," Adrian said. "I want to hear it before anything else." A brief pause. Not discomfort, more like she was ensuring she said it correctly. "I fired you this morning based on 15 seconds of security footage and the framing of a man I should have been more skeptical of. I didn't ask for your account. I didn't ask for a fuller review of the footage. I reacted under pressure and I made the wrong call, and it was wrong in a way that I can't fix by explaining the circumstances." She held his eyes. "I'm sorry, genuinely." Adrian let that sit for a moment. He was not someone who accepted apologies quickly or performed graciousness for the comfort of the person apologizing. He held it, assessed it, and found that it was what it sounded like, imperfect and real. "Okay," he said, "show me what you have." What they had was, to put it plainly, a ruin. The IT security lead, Greg, the careful man with the bad news demeanor, walked Adrian through the state of the project files in the smaller conference room adjacent to the one where they'd met. There was a laptop open on the table connected to the project drive, and Greg narrated what was visible and what wasn't in the neutral, factual tone of someone describing a car after an accident. "Here's the frame. Here's what's structurally intact. Here's what you're not getting back." The 8-day-old backup contained the early architecture of the identity system, the foundational thinking, the initial type selection, the primary color logic. It was the skeleton of the thing, the underlying decision-making that had driven all the subsequent development. What was gone was the implementation, the refined type system with its full weight and spacing documentation, the expanded color palette with all its functional applications and accessibility specifications, the grid infrastructure, the component library that had taken the longest to build, the full usage documentation that would allow the client's internal teams to apply the system consistently going forward. Adrian sat at the table and went through the backup files methodically. Nobody spoke while he was looking. Victoria stood near the door with her arms crossed, and Greg sat 2 chairs down, and Priya, who had appeared at some point and taken a chair at the far end without announcing herself, watched the screen over Adrian's shoulder with an expression of concentrated focus that suggested she was doing her own assessment simultaneously. He spent 22 minutes going through everything. He opened files, closed them, opened others. He ran a rough calculation in his head of what existed versus what the completed system would have required. He thought about the Harman presentation, which he knew about only from what Victoria had told him on the phone. A major regional media company, skeptical client, high-stakes pitch, 5 days out. When he was done, he sat back. "Well," Victoria said. "Recovery isn't the right frame," Adrian said. "What's here is too incomplete to recover from. You'd spend the first 2 days figuring out what decisions were made and why, and then the next 3 days trying to rebuild on top of that reasoning, and what you'd end up with would be a patchwork. You'd be able to see the seams. So you're saying it's not salvageable?" "I'm saying recovery isn't salvageable. Building is different." She looked at him. "What's the difference?" "Recovery means you're trying to get back to where you were. Building means you start from the logic that's still here." He gestured at the screen. "And you go forward. You don't try to reconstruct the steps that were deleted. You understand what the system was trying to accomplish, and you build a new implementation of it from scratch." He paused. "The backup has enough of the foundational thinking to do that. Barely, but enough. In 5 days. In 4. You need 1 day of buffer before the presentation for review and final prep." He looked at the screen. "Who was working on the component library?" Priya raised her hand slightly, the way someone does in a room when they're not sure if they're technically supposed to be in the conversation. "I was, me and 2 others." "How well do you know the logic of what was built? Not the files, the reasoning behind the component decisions." Priya thought about it. "Pretty well. Darren made a lot of the calls, but the structural decisions were worked out in sessions with the full team. I was in most of them." "Most of them or all of them?" "All of them that mattered." Adrian looked at her more carefully. She was maybe 30, with an engineer's habit of not filling silence with reassurance, which he respected. "Can you document the component logic from memory? Not rebuild the files yet, just write down the decision tree. Why each component was structured the way it was." "I can try." "Don't try. Either you can or you can't. I need to know." A pause. "I can." "Then start now. Before anything else, before you talk to anyone about anything, go somewhere quiet and write down everything you remember about the component logic. Don't look at the backup files while you do it. I want your memory of the reasoning, not what you can reverse engineer from what's left." Priya looked at Victoria, who gave a small nod, and then Priya closed her own laptop, stood up, and left the room. Adrian looked back at the screen. "I need to see the client brief," he said. "The original. Not what the creative team was working from. The initial document from Harmon about who they are and what they want. Greg looked at Victoria. That's in a separate archive, Victoria said. I can get it to you in 10 minutes. And I need to talk to the account lead. Whoever's been the primary contact with Harmon. That's Elise Morrow. She's on 38. Can she come up here? Victoria picked up her phone. Elise Morrow was a woman in her late 40s who had the particular energy of someone who had been managing a crisis for 3 hours and was holding it together through sheer professional competence and probably one too many coffees. She came into the conference room with a leather folio under one arm and the look of someone who had been briefed on who Adrian was and was making rapid assessments. You worked on the Meridian rebrand, she said before sitting down. 2015. I was on the agency side before I came to Asterion. I followed that project. It was a long project, Adrian said. It was good work. She sat down. What do you need from me? Tell me about the Harmon contact, not the company, the person. Who do we actually have to get to, yes? Elise set the folio down. The primary decision maker is their CMO, a man named Richard Holt. He's been with Harmon for 9 years, came up through editorial, has strong opinions about their positioning that he doesn't always articulate clearly, but absolutely knows when they're not being honored. She paused. Their first rebrand failed in 2016 because the agency came in with a system that was elegant but felt like it was designed for what the agency thought Harmon should be, not what Harmon actually was. And the second? 2019. Too conservative. They hired a firm that was so worried about overstepping that they produced something that didn't say anything. Holt killed it after the first presentation. So he wants something that's right for them, not right in the abstract. Correct. What does he think Harmon actually is? Not what's in the brief. What does he say when he talks about it? Elise thought about that. He talks about being the paper of record for a region that the national media treats as a flyover. He talks about being trusted. He comes back to that word a lot. Trusted. He says Harmon readers have been with the company for 30 years because they trust Harmon to tell them what's true, not what's interesting. She paused. He's a little suspicious of the word brand as a concept. He thinks it implies artifice. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Does that help? It tells me what the system has to feel like. It can't look like it's trying to be impressive. It has to look like it's trying to be accurate. Elise looked at him with an expression that he couldn't quite categorize. Something between reassessment and relief. Two things that don't often arrive together. That's more useful than anything Darren said in the last month, she said. Not diplomatically, just honestly. Victoria came back into the room at 12:30 with two things. The original Harmon brief in a sealed envelope, and a question she'd been holding for 2 hours. Adrian was at the table with the backup files open on one laptop, and the client brief now open on a second, and he was writing longhand in a yellow legal pad in the kind of sustained, focused way that made it clear interrupting him would cost something. Victoria sat down across from him and waited until he finished a page and flipped it. I need to discuss the terms, she said. He set the pen down. Terms. If you agree to take this on, I want to formalize it. Contract basis, obviously. Design lead with full creative authority over the Harmon system for the duration. Compensation at a rate commensurate with senior creative director billing. That's not enough. She looked at him. I want it in writing that the work product is credited to me, not to Asterion's creative team, not to a team led by. My name on the system documentation and on the presentation materials. She didn't answer immediately. That's an unusual ask, she said. The client relationship is Asterion's. The system will be mine. I'm not asking for the client relationship. I'm asking for authorship of the work. Darren's name has been on this project. Darren deleted the project. His name can come off. He said it without malice, just matter-of-factly. This isn't negotiable. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then, what else? Protected independence. I work with Priya and whoever she needs from the dev team, and I work with Elise for client context. I don't work through layers of approval. I don't present interim options to a committee. When I've made a decision about the system, the decision is made. I can give you that within reason, not within reason completely. If you want approval rights on the final output before it goes to the client, fine. But everything that happens between now and that final review is mine to direct. She was quiet for a long moment. He could see her doing what competent people do when they're considering something they're not sure about, not feeling it out, but actually thinking through the logic of it, which was different. And if you build something I can't present to Harmon, then you don't present it. He met her eyes. But I won't. I know what this brief is asking for, and I know how to answer it. What I need is to not have my answer negotiated away piece by piece before it gets to the room. She looked at the legal pad in front of him, at the 2 laptops open on the table, at the Harmon brief with its pages dog-eared already from 40 minutes of reading. Okay, she said. In writing. Janet will have a contract to you by 3 o'clock. He nodded, picked up the pen, went back to the legal pad. She stayed in the chair for a moment, watching him work, before she stood up and left. He didn't look up when she left. He was already somewhere else. The specific mental state that happened when a design problem got big enough to fill the available space and everything outside it started to recede. It had been a long time since he'd felt that. Longer than 6 years. Maybe the last year or two before he'd left, when the feeling had been replaced by exhaustion, the problem no longer filling him up but pressing down on him instead. It felt different now, narrower, more deliberate. He was not the same person who had left. He understood that. Whatever he built here would be built by the person he was now, quieter, more stripped down, less interested in being impressive and more interested in being right. Whether that was better or worse than what he'd been before, he couldn't say. He kept writing. By 2 p.m., Priya was back. She'd been gone for an hour and 40 minutes, and she came back with 7 pages of handwritten notes, which she set on the table in front of Adrian without preamble. Component logic, she said, from memory. I think I got about 80% of the decision tree. There are 3 areas where I'm not confident. I marked them. Adrian picked up the notes and read them. She sat across from him and waited, which he appreciated. Some people couldn't sit quietly while someone read their work, felt compelled to narrate or explain or preemptively defend. Priya just waited. He read all 7 pages. He asked 2 questions, one about the navigation component and one about the typographic scale, and she answered both without hedging. This is better than 80%, he said. Don't flatter me. I'm not. He set the notes down. The navigation reasoning and the color application logic are both solid enough to build from directly. The 3 gaps you marked, he pointed to them. I can fill in from the brief. They were probably driven by client feedback anyway, not system logic. Priya looked at the notes. I tried to remember what we were thinking, not just what we built. I don't know if that's what you needed. It's exactly what I needed. She was quiet for a second. Then, who are you actually? I mean, I know what I was told this morning, which was that you're cleaning staff who got fired. Then I was told something else. I haven't had time to Google anything. He looked at her. Does it matter? I'm about to spend 4 days working under creative direction from you. I'd like to know if you're worth following. It was a direct question, and he gave it a direct answer. I ran the Meridian Identity Project in 2015. I designed the Atlas Financial Visual System in 2012. I was the lead on the Crestfield Media rebrand in 2017 before I left the industry. Priya's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically. She was not a dramatic expression person, but there was a recognition there. I know the Atlas system, she said slowly. We studied it. It's in the curriculum at Northwestern's design program. They teach it as an example of scalable identity architecture, he said, which is what we're building here on a shorter timeline. Why are you cleaning floors? Because I chose to. He said it without defense or apology, and because it stopped being my choice this morning in a way I didn't agree with. She sat with that for a moment. Then she nodded, once the way you nod when you've gotten enough of an answer to proceed, even if you don't have all of it. What do you need me to do first? The next few hours were the part of a design engagement that no one outside the process ever saw, and that Adrian had always thought was the most important part, the stage before any visible work happened, where the thinking got built. He worked through the brief again, this time with Elise in the room to answer questions about specific language choices the client had used, He went through Priya's component notes again and reorganized them into a sequence that matched the order in which the system would need to be built. He thought about Richard Holt saying trusted and what that meant translated into visual language. Not safe, not conservative, not the visual equivalent of a beige conference room. Trusted was earned. Trusted had weight. It looked like something that had been here before you arrived and would be here after you left. He filled 6 pages of the legal pad. At 4:30, the contract arrived. He read it carefully. He'd learned in his previous life that reading contracts carefully was not paranoia but basic professional hygiene, and found it was, in fact, what Victoria had described. He signed it, took a photo on his phone, and sent the original to Janet via the runner she'd sent down. At 5:15, he gathered Priya and the 2 other developers she'd identified as essential and gave them the first set of tasks. Not the full picture yet, not because he was being mysterious, but because giving people the full picture before they had enough context to work with it was counterproductive. He gave them what they needed to begin and told them he'd have a structural framework ready by morning. "What time?" one of the developers asked. His name was Sam, mid-20s, with the look of someone who had been running on adrenaline since Priya's Slack message that morning and was committed to running on it further. 7 a.m., Adrian said. Sam nodded like this was perfectly reasonable. After they left, Adrian sat alone in the conference room for a while. The city outside was moving into the hour when the light changed, when the afternoon yellow deepened and the glass towers started throwing it back at odd angles, and the lake went the color of pewter. He'd seen this light from the 41st floor hundreds of times, always through a window while he was moving, never just sitting and watching it. He sat and watched it. His phone showed a text from a number he didn't recognize until he read the message. "This is Marcus. I wanted you to know I documented everything accurately. I don't know what happens from here, but I wanted you to know." He replied, "I know. Thank you." Not much to say beyond that. Marcus was a decent man in a situation that hadn't left him much room to be more than decent, and that was not nothing. He thought about the contract in his phone photo. His name on the system documentation. It had been 6 years since his name was on anything. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Not triumphant, not sentimental, more like someone who has been carrying a weight for long enough that they stopped noticing it, and then they set it down briefly, and they noticed its absence in their body. He turned back to the legal pad. The work wouldn't think about itself. That had always been the one thing he could rely on. The work didn't care about any of this. It just needed to be done, and done right. And the only way to do that was to think clearly and start. He wrote the words, Harmon Identity, Structural Framework, Draft 1, and underneath that he began. Down on the 35th floor, in a windowed office that was considerably nicer than the one he deserved, Darren Cross sat across from 2 lawyers he had not chosen, and 1 investigator from IT security who kept a tablet in his lap and made notes without looking up. Darren was a good-looking man. This was relevant because he had always known it and had always known how to use it. In rooms, in presentations, in conversations where the objective was to make the other person feel like things were going more smoothly than they were. He was 44, well-dressed even now, with the particular polish of someone who had spent years crafting an exterior that said, "I am the most competent person here." He had not done a good job this morning of maintaining that exterior. The lawyers had been clear. He was not under arrest, was not being charged with anything as of this moment, was being held pending a review of the situation, and was advised in the strongest possible terms not to discuss the circumstances with anyone on staff. He had his own attorney arriving from a downtown firm in approximately 40 minutes, and until then the recommendation was to say as little as possible. Darren was having difficulty saying as little as possible. "I want to make something clear," he said. Not to the lawyers, to the IT investigator who looked up. "Whatever the logs show, you need to understand there are people at this company who had access to my credentials." "We're aware that credential sharing is possible," the investigator said. "I'm not saying I shared them. I'm saying someone could have obtained them. That's a very different thing." "It is a different thing," the investigator agreed. He made a note. His tone was so neutral, it was almost architectural. Darren sat back. He was good at reading rooms, and this room was not going well, and the part of his brain that had always been very good at finding the exit from a bad room was working hard. He thought about the cleaning guy. He'd seen him on the floor before. Quiet, gray uniform, the kind of person you look past without meaning to. It had been such a clean solution when it presented itself. The guy handling the design sheet, the camera footage, the 15-second window that framed correctly to someone exhausted and pressured and already looking for a reason to act, looked exactly like a security breach. He'd gone to Victoria's office early, before she'd even seen the HR alert. He'd been very careful about what he said. Serious concern. Everything at stake. I'm not making accusations. He had been making an accusation. He'd just been making it with plausible deniability. It had worked for about 3 hours, which was less time than he'd needed. The problem with the credential argument, and Darren knew this even as he was making it, was that the log showed not just the deletion but the navigation to the files, which followed a pattern consistent with someone who knew exactly where everything was kept and exactly what order to remove it in. And the email chain from the proxy account, which he hadn't known they'd found already, was going to be considerably harder to explain. His attorney arrived 8 minutes ahead of schedule, which was a small mercy. Her name was Kathleen, and she came in with the brisk, contained energy of someone who had seen worse than this and was not going to perform alarm. "Don't say anything else," she said, as her first sentence in the room. Darren looked at her and then at the IT investigator and then at the window, where the city was going gold in the late afternoon. "I built that project," he said before Kathleen could stop him. "From nothing, I built it. Darren, I want that noted. Whatever else is in those logs, whatever you think happened, that project exists because of me." Nobody in the room said anything. Kathleen put her hand on his arm, not gently, in the way you touch someone who needs comfort, but firmly, in the way you touch someone who is about to do something they can't undo. He stopped talking. 41 floors above him, in a conference room where the evening light was coming in clean off the lake, the man who was going to rebuild what Darren had destroyed was turning to a fresh page in his legal pad and starting again. That was the thing about work done right. It didn't announce itself. It didn't require an audience. It just existed, or it didn't, and the only person who had to live with which one was true was the person who did it. Adrian wrote until 9 p.m. when the building's overnight staff started coming in on the lower floors. He could hear, faintly, the sound of a cleaning cart somewhere below him. The soft roll of wheels, the particular rhythm of someone moving through a space they knew by heart. He listened to it for a moment. Then he turned back to the page. He was back at 7, as promised. The city was doing what Chicago did in early morning in late October, throwing cold air off the lake with a kind of indifferent hostility, the sky the color of old pewter, the streets still wet from rain that had come through overnight. Adrian had slept 4 hours, which was not enough, and also was enough, because 4 hours had been sufficient to let his brain process what he'd worked out the night before and confirm that the structural framework held up under the review that only happens when you come back to something with rested eyes. He'd eaten breakfast standing at his kitchen counter, eggs, toast, coffee, the same thing every morning, and he'd thought about the Harmon brief while he ate, and then he'd made himself stop thinking about it and get on the train, because the kind of thinking that happens on an empty stomach before you've finished your coffee was rarely the kind of thinking you wanted to act on. The 41st floor was quiet when he arrived. He'd been given a temporary access card the night before, not his old facilities card, a new one, white instead of gray, with a different set of permissions that got him into the elevator bank and onto the relevant floors and nowhere else. He held it against the reader on the conference room door, and the light turned green, and he went in and turned on the lights and set up the 2 laptops and put his legal pad on the table and poured coffee from the carafe that someone, Janet, he assumed, because the executive assistant was the one who handled all the details that everyone else forgot, had left on the credenza. He had the structural framework drafted. 6 pages of the legal pad, front and back, with the logic of the Harmon identity system laid out in the specific sequential way that his brain had always organized design problems. Not in the visual language of mood boards and reference images, which was how most creative directors communicated in the early stages of a project, but in the language of decisions and their consequences. If the system commits to this, then this becomes possible, and this becomes excluded. Decision trees, not aesthetics. The aesthetics came later. The aesthetics were the last mile of a much longer road. Priya arrived at 7:04 with 2 of her people, Sam, from the day before, and a quieter woman named Dee, who had said almost nothing during the previous afternoon's briefing, but whose notes, which Adrian had glanced at, were precise and well organized in a way that said more about her competence than talking would have. "How'd you sleep?" Sam asked Adrian, with the slightly manic energy of someone who had not slept particularly well and was pretending otherwise. "Fine," Adrian said. "Did you get the component list I sent last night?" "Got it." Dee built a preliminary file architecture around it. Adrian looked at Dee. "Any problems with the logic?" Dee considered the question with what seemed like genuine care rather than social performance. 1. The navigation system. You have it set up to be responsive down to mobile, but the Harman brief specifies print applications as primary. The responsive behavior might fight the print logic at the grid level. It was a correct observation. He had been aware of it and had mentally flagged it as something to resolve, but he hadn't resolved it yet, and the fact that she'd seen it in a preliminary file architecture review without him flagging it first told him something useful about her. "You're right," he said. "We're going to weight the grid for print as primary and build the responsive behavior as a derivative. I'll have the revised grid logic to you by noon." Dee nodded and sat down without making anything of the fact that she'd caught something. Priya sat across from Adrian. "What's the sequence?" He turned the legal pad to face her. "Foundation layer first. Type system and color system. Built simultaneously but documented independently. Those have to be locked before anything downstream gets touched, because every other decision in the system branches from them." He tapped a section of the page. "The backup has enough of the type rationale to work from. What it doesn't have is the full weight documentation. The spacing logic for every weight and size combination. That's going to have to be rebuilt from scratch. That took us 2 weeks the first time." "I know, we're doing it in a day and a half." Priya looked at him without expression for a moment. "Okay. Not by cutting corners, by making decisions faster." The original process probably involved a lot of iteration and committee review. We're not doing that. I'm going to make the typographic decisions, you're going to tell me if there are technical reasons they don't work, and we're going to move. What if I think a decision is wrong for non-technical reasons? He looked at her. Then tell me. I told Victoria I wanted protected independence, not a room full of yes people. If you see something, say it. Okay. She looked at the legal pad. When do we get to the component library? Day 3, if we're on schedule. And if we're not on schedule? We will be. She gave him the look that a person gives when they're not sure whether confidence and delusion are the same thing in a given context, but are willing to find out. The type decisions took most of the morning. This was the part of the process that was hardest to explain to people outside it, the way that what looked like a simple choice, like which typeface a company used, was actually the result of a layered series of judgments that had to account for legibility at every size from a byline in a 6-point footer to a 200-point headline, for the specific way the face handled long-form reading versus display usage, for how it behaved in print versus on screen, for whether its personality was legible to a general audience or only to people who read about typefaces, for whether it would still feel appropriate to the brand in 10 years, or whether it was carrying too much of the visual language of this particular moment. Adrian had done this enough times that most of the judgment was fast. Not intuitive, exactly, but compressed. He could run the calculation quickly, but the documentation had to be slow, because the documentation was what the client's team would use to apply the system after Asterion was out of the picture, and documentation that assumed knowledge the client didn't have was worthless. He worked through the morning with the legal pad in both laptops, writing longhand and then translating to the shared drive in a format that Priya could use directly. He didn't explain what he was doing while he was doing it. Priya and her team worked in the same room without requiring narration, which suited him. He'd worked with people in his previous life who needed the thought process externalized in real time, and he'd found it exhausting in the way that being asked to translate as you're thinking is exhausting. At 10:30, Elise came in with a question. She knocked on the doorframe even though the door was open, which he noticed as a small courtesy. Richard Holt's assistant called. He wants a brief status update. Their board is asking questions about the timeline. What can I tell him? Tell him we're on track. Are we? Yes. She looked at the room. The laptops, the legal pad, the 3-person team working at different sections of the table. Can I tell him something more specific? Tell him the foundational architecture is being rebuilt from the ground up rather than recovered, which will result in a cleaner system, and that the presentation timeline is unchanged. Elise wrote that down. Then, he's going to ask if there was a problem. There was a problem. The problem is being addressed. He's going to want to know what kind of problem. Adrian looked at her. That's a conversation between Harmon and Asterian's account team, not a design matter. Right. She paused at the door. Is there anything you need from me right now? Yes. The presentation deck from the failed 2016 rebrand. If Harmon shared it as part of the briefing process. I want to see what they rejected. Elise looked surprised, not at the request exactly, but at the specificity of it. I think we have that in the background research files. I'll check. And the 2019 one too. I'll find them. She left. Sam watched her go and then looked at Adrian. Why do you want the failed ones? Because the failed ones tell you what the client's actual rejection criteria are. The brief tells you what they say they want. The failed work tells you what they refuse to accept. Sam thought about that. That's kind of forensic. It's design. Someone already spent money figuring out what doesn't work. Seems wasteful not to learn from it. Dumb. The 2016 deck arrived by email at noon, forwarded from Asterian's archive, and Adrian went through it during the 30 minutes he'd allocated for lunch. A sandwich from the lobby cafe, eaten at the conference table, which he knew was not an ideal lunch situation, and also understood was how this week was going to go. The 2016 work was exactly what Elise had described. Elegant, sophisticated, and absolutely wrong for Harmon. The agency that had produced it had designed a visual system that would have been at home on the cover of a European design magazine. A spare, highly geometric identity with a custom typeface that was beautiful in a way that was entirely about the typeface and not at all about what it was meant to communicate. It said, "We are contemporary, refined, considered." What it didn't say was anything that sounded like 30 years of being the paper of record for the upper Midwest. Richard Holt had been right to kill it. The 2019 work was different in its failure mode. He went through it in 10 minutes. This one had been the overcompensation. The agency had heard Harmon values trust and continuity, and produced something that was so conservative it looked like it hadn't changed since 1987. Safe, reliable, invisible. The visual equivalent of a firm handshake with no follow-through, also right to kill. What both of them told him was something useful about Holt's thinking. He wasn't rejecting on the basis of personal taste. He was rejecting on the basis of fit. He had a clear sense of what Harmon was, and an equally clear sense when a design system was answering a different question than the one he'd asked. He'd been waiting, across 2 failed attempts in 6 years, for someone to answer the right question. Adrian wrote at the bottom of his notes, "The system has to feel like it's been earned, not designed, earned." He thought about what that looked like. Not in the abstract, specifically. He thought about what typographic choices communicated that something had been built through use rather than invented whole cloth. He thought about the specific weight of newsprint, about the particular way editorial design, real editorial design, the kind that had developed over decades in the context of actual journalism, handled the relationship between text and space, not nostalgic, not retro, but rooted. He thought about it through the rest of lunch, and by the time he set the empty sandwich wrapper aside, he knew what the typeface decision was going to be, and he knew why. By mid-afternoon, 2 things happened in parallel. The first was that the type system took shape. It wasn't finished. It wouldn't be finished today, but the primary decisions were locked. The typeface selection, the scale ratios, the weight logic. Priya had reviewed it and raised one technical concern about screen rendering at small sizes that Adrian had addressed by adjusting one ratio in the scale. Dee had built the first 2 pages of documentation, and the documentation was clear. The second thing was Victoria Cole walking into the conference room at 3:15 with an expression that Adrian had not seen on her face before, which was something he might have described, if pressed, as unguarded. She looked at the work on the table, the laptops, the draft documentation, the walls where they'd put up a few printed reference points, and she looked at it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for assessment, which made him think she was dealing with something that had nothing to do with the design work. "There's a development," she said. He set down his pen. Darren's attorney contacted our legal team this morning. He's cooperating with the internal review. She paused. He's claiming the deletion was... She stopped, chose a different word. He has an explanation he's presenting. I wanted you to know that the investigation is ongoing and we'll likely have more information by tomorrow. Adrian looked at her. Is there a reason you're telling me this now? Because the outcome of the investigation may affect how we characterize this situation to Harmon's account team, and that affects Elise's talking points. She said it levelly. It's information that affects the project. He understood that was true, and also understood it wasn't the only reason she was here. He didn't press it. And the other thing, he said. She looked at him. You came down here to tell me something, and that's the official version, he said. Not unkindly. What's the other thing? A pause. Not long. She was not a person who let pauses go long. The facilities team flagged something this morning. When your things were cleared from your locker after this morning, they found a sketchbook. She held it out. I wanted to make sure it got back to you. It was a black hardcover sketchbook, the standard moleskin kind, worn at the corners and slightly swollen from use. He took it. How many people looked at it? He asked. I did, she said. Briefly. I wanted to make sure it was personal and not related to anything. She stopped. That's not true. I looked at it because I was curious. She said it without apology, but with what seemed like actual honesty. The work in it is good, very good. He held the sketchbook. He hadn't thought about it since morning. In the velocity of everything that had happened since 6:23 a.m., the fact that he'd left a sketchbook in a locker that got cleared out hadn't entered his mind. Thank you, he said. Victoria nodded and started to leave, then paused at the door. Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer. Go ahead. Why did you walk away from it, the industry? She asked it the way people ask things they've been wanting to ask for a while and have finally found the moment that makes it feel less intrusive. I looked at the Meridian system this morning. I spent 20 minutes looking at it. It's not just good, it's unusually good. And you left it to... She gestured slightly, indicating the world in general and the gray uniform she'd last seen him in. Why? He turned the sketchbook over in his hands, the worn corners, the slight swell of it. It stopped feeling like mine, he said. The work. It was technically mine, but it didn't feel like it. He paused. And then some other things happened, and I needed to not care about whether anything was mine for a while. She stood in the door and didn't say she understood, which he respected because she couldn't have understood specifically, and saying so would have been hollow. And now? She asked. He looked at the legal pad, at the type scale documented in careful longhand, at the Harmon brief with its creased pages and his annotations in the margins. Now it feels like mine again, he said, which is inconvenient, frankly. Something almost like a smile crossed her face, quick, controlled, but real. Then she left. Priya, who had not appeared to be listening to any of this, said, without looking up from her screen, Inconvenient how? Because things that feel like yours are harder to lose. She considered that for a moment. Is that why you kept the sketchbook in your locker instead of at home? He looked at her. You were listening. I'm always listening. I'm just quiet about it. She looked at her screen. I keep my personal design notebooks at work too. I tell myself it's because I might need them, but I think actually it's because I want them to be part of a work context, even when they're just for me. She paused, like keeping a foot in the door. He didn't say anything to that. He set the sketchbook to the side of the table, not in his bag, and went back to the legal pad. The afternoon ran into the evening again. Sam got dinner, a range of takeout containers deposited on the credenza at 6:30 without fanfare, because Sam had developed the accurate read that this particular project was not going to pause for dinner, and the right move was to make dinner available and let people decide for themselves. Adrian ate a bowl of something with rice in it while going through a section of the color documentation. He wasn't sure what the something was and didn't ask. The color system was, in some ways, more complicated than the type system, because color and editorial design had a specific politics to it. Colors that worked in consumer branding carried certain associations that could undermine a news organization's implied claim to objectivity, while colors that were appropriately neutral could produce a visual system with all the life of an obituary page. The original Harman palette, from what existed in the backup, had been heading in the right direction. A careful primary structure with a deep navy and a warm black, and a constrained use of a particular red that was close to, but distinct from, the kind of generic news organization red that every cable channel and major paper had been using since the 90s. The red was the interesting decision, and Adrian spent longer on it than anything else. He brought Priya in on it at 7 p.m. "Look at the red." She looked at his screen where he had the original backup color alongside 4 variations he'd been testing. "What about it?" "It needs to be different enough from network news red that it reads as a deliberate choice, not a category default. But if it goes too far from the family, it stops reading as authoritative. News is associated with a particular value, temperature, and color. You can't ignore that entirely without losing something important." Priya studied the 4 options. "The third one? Why?" "It's the only one that doesn't remind me of something else I've already seen. The first 2 are both in the family of primary news red. The 4th goes too warm. It starts reading like a logo for something else, something product-based. The 3rd has more brown in it. It's aged without being old." He'd been thinking the same thing, but he'd wanted to hear it said by someone else to make sure he wasn't just seeing what he wanted to see. "What does it remind you of?" She thought for a second. "Brick, old brick, like the old newspaper buildings." That was not quite what he was going for, but it was adjacent to it in a way that told him the direction was right. It's supposed to read like something that was decided a long time ago and has been consistently applied. Something with history. Brick works for that. "Brick works?" He locked the red. Sam, who had been listening while apparently building file structures, said, "This is a weird way to spend a Tuesday evening." "Spend it somewhere else if you want," Adrian said, without heat. "I don't want to," Sam said. "I just wanted to note that this is a weird way to spend a Tuesday evening." He paused. "It's also kind of interesting. I've never watched someone make these decisions in real time before. Usually, I just get handed a brief and told to build the components. That's because the decision-making usually happens off-site, in client workshops, in presentations, across 5 weeks of managed process." He kept his eyes on the screen. "We don't have 5 weeks. Does it feel different, doing it this way?" Adrian considered the question. "It feels more honest, actually. There's no time to second guess. You have to trust your first right answer." "How do you know when you've got the first right answer versus just the first answer?" "The first right answer is the one that solves more than one problem at the same time." He pointed at the red on screen. "The color solves the distinctiveness problem and the authority problem simultaneously. A color that only solves one would be the first answer. A color that solves both is the first right answer." Sam was quiet for a moment. "I didn't learn that in school. Most things worth knowing aren't in the curriculum." He didn't mean it cynically, just factually. Quiet. At 8 p.m., there was a knock on the conference room door, and it was not a knock Adrian expected. The man in the doorway was in his early 60s, heavy-set, with white hair, and the look of someone who had once been physically formidable and still carried some of that in the way he stood. He was wearing a suit that probably cost $3,000 and holding a styrofoam cup of coffee that probably cost $3.50. Adrian had never seen him before. "I'm looking for Adrian Cole," the man said. "That's me." "My name is Walter Hess. I'm on the board." He said it simply, like he was stating weather. "Victoria told me you were here and I wanted to come see for myself." He looked at the room. "She wouldn't let me come down until now. Said you needed to work without interruptions." She was right. She usually is. He took a step into the room. "Can I look?" Something in the directness of it, the question asked without performing authority, made Adrian gesture at the table. Hess came over and looked at the screens, at the printed color swatches that had accumulated, at the pages of the legal pad with their careful columns of notes. He didn't touch anything. He stood there for a while longer than a casual look, and Adrian let him stand there because Hess was looking in the way that people look when they actually see something rather than when they're performing the act of looking. "I've been on this board for 11 years, Hess said eventually. "We've been trying to answer the Harman question for 3 of them. That's what we call it internally, the Harmon question. He looked at the color swatches. What's the question? How do you tell a media organization that it's already what it wants to be? How do you build a visual system that says, you don't need to become something new. You need to look like what you actually are? Hess turned to look at him. That's a harder sell than transformation. It's a harder design problem. It's a better sell. A pause. How so? Because they've tried transformation twice, and it felt false both times. Holt rejected it because he knows Harmon better than any outside agency, and transformation felt like the agency was telling him his company needed to be different from what it is. What he actually wants is to be recognized, to have the outside reflect what's already true on the inside. Adrian looked at the color on his screen. That's not a rebrand in the traditional sense. It's an articulation. A brand finding its own language for something it's always known about itself. Hess was quiet for a moment that felt considered rather than empty. Darren Cross pitched us transformation, he said. That was his language. We're going to transform Harmon's market positioning. I know. You reviewed his approach? I reviewed what's left of his approach. The foundation of it was sound. The direction it was heading was wrong. How can the foundation be sound if the direction is wrong? Because the foundation is about structure. The direction is about interpretation. You can have a well-built framework pointed at the wrong answer. He paused. Which is what I'm correcting. Hess held the styrofoam cup in both hands and looked at the room once more. Then he looked at Adrian directly, with the kind of look that a person who has run boards for a long time uses when they're making an assessment they'll act on. Victoria says she's given you full creative authority. She has. She says you asked for it as a condition. I did. That's unusual. Most people ask for more resources, more time, more money. Resources, time, and money are useful, Adrian said. Authority is necessary. There's a difference. Hess smiled for the first time. Not a large smile, the kind of small, specific smile that meant something had landed correctly. All right, he said. He stepped back from the table. I won't take any more of your evening. Thank you for coming down. Hess paused at the door. The sketchbook on the table there, is that yours? Yes. I looked at about 3 pages before Victoria told me not to. He paused. The one with the lettering studies. I don't know enough about design to tell you what's technically good about it, but it looks like it was done by someone who does it because they have to, not because they're supposed to. He lifted the styrofoam cup slightly in a kind of informal salute and left. Priya waited until his footsteps had faded down the corridor, then said, He looked at your personal sketchbook? Apparently. Is that annoying? Adrian considered it. A little, he said, but not entirely. He picked the sketchbook up and moved it to his bag. Then he went back to the color documentation. Bâtiment. Darren Cross, somewhere on the 35th floor in a room Adrian had never been to and had no interest in, was having a different kind of evening. The cooperation he'd offered had not gone the way he'd expected cooperation to go. His attorney had advised that getting ahead of the investigation, being forthcoming, framing himself as a person who had made serious mistakes under severe pressure, was the best available strategy. What Darren had discovered, as the evening progressed, was that the IT team's forensics were more thorough than he'd anticipated, and that the version of events he'd been able to construct in the shock of the morning had several problems when examined against the actual log data. The proxy email chain was the worst of it. He'd set it up 9 days ago, which the forensics team was able to establish precisely, and 9 days ago was 3 days before the cleaning staff incident that he'd claimed was the trigger for his concerns about project security, which meant the concerns had preceded the incident, which meant the incident had been an opportunity he'd been waiting for, rather than a cause he'd been responding to. His attorney, Kathleen, had been clear about the implications and had been clear about what the best path forward looked like from this point, which was a path considerably less comfortable than what Darren had planned. He sat in the room, a minor conference room with no window, which was a detail that felt pointed, and looked at the table and thought about the cleaning cart going bad wheel and all down the corridor of the 41st floor at 4:47 in the morning, and about the 15-second clip of a man picking up a piece of paper, and about how clean it had seemed at the time. He had built real things. He had. That part of what he'd said to the investigator was true, even if the framing was defensive. He had spent 18 months building client relationships and managing a team and developing a creative direction that, whatever its ultimate correctness, had represented genuine work. The project had not appeared from nowhere. What it also hadn't appeared from, he was now sitting quietly with the understanding of, was the specific, technical, structural competence that the project actually required to cross the finish line. He had been good at the parts he was good at, and had managed the parts he wasn't good at by surrounding himself with people who were, and by ensuring that his name and not theirs was what appeared in the briefings and the board presentations. That was not nothing. It was also not enough. And the gap between those two things was where everything had eventually gone wrong. He didn't let himself think about the man who was on the 41st floor right now. Or some floor, he wasn't sure which floor, and that detail somehow made it worse. He didn't let himself think about what was happening up there. What he let himself think about, at the end of the evening, sitting alone in the windowless room waiting for the process to conclude, was that he had spent a great deal of energy his entire career ensuring that the work of people who were better than him at specific things did not outshine his own presence in the room. And it had worked for a long time, and then it had stopped working, and the way it had stopped working was this. Adrian left the building at 10:30 p.m. The night air hit him at the lobby doors, cold, sharp, the lake smell in it. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, bag over one shoulder, sketchbook inside it. The city at this hour had its own quality, the streetlights doing what they always did, the distant sound of traffic a block over, a couple walking past on the opposite sidewalk without looking at him. He thought about what Hess had said. It looks like it was done by someone who does it because they have to. He had a train to catch. He had to be back in 7 hours. He had the grid logic to revise before tomorrow morning and 2 more sections of the color documentation to finish, and the component framework starting the day after. He started walking toward the station. The wind came off the lake and cut through his jacket, and he pulled it tighter around him and kept walking, head down, moving through the cold the way you move through things when there was no other option, without ceremony, without resistance, with just the steady mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other and trusting that where you were going was worth arriving at. He'd find out in 4 days whether he was right. The grid revision took him until 1 a.m. He did it at his kitchen table, which was where he'd always done his best solitary thinking. Not at a desk, not in a dedicated workspace, just the small table by the window with the city sounds coming in faint through the glass and the lamp making a circle of yellow light on the legal pad. He'd tried working at a proper desk for most of his career and had eventually accepted that the table was where his brain cooperated and that there was no version of himself that was going to become a desk person. You worked where you worked. You stopped arguing with it. The grid problem Dee had flagged was real, and the solution wasn't simple because the tension between print and digital grid logic was a genuine structural issue rather than a matter of preference. Print grids were built on fixed dimensions, on the physical constraints of a page, on the way the eye tracked across paper. Digital grids were built on proportional relationships, on flexible containers, on the assumption that the viewing context was variable, building a system that treated print as primary while still allowing coherent digital application required, making a specific set of decisions about where the two logics would be allowed to diverge and where they had to remain consistent. He worked through it in the specific way he worked through problems that required sustained concentration, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the structure of the solution revealed itself. The first approach he tried didn't work, which he knew 15 minutes in and scrapped without ceremony. The second approach was closer but introduced a complication at the narrow column level that would make the digital documentation confusing to implement. The third approach, which arrived, as third approaches often did, carrying parts of the first two, was right. He wrote it out in full, 6 pages. He checked it 3 times from different angles, looking for the place where it would break, and it didn't break. He went to bed at 1:17, set an alarm for 5:45. Day 3. He was on the 41st floor by 6:50, 10 minutes before the agreed time, and Dee was already there. She was at her laptop with a takeout coffee and an expression of deep focus that suggested she'd either come in early because she wanted to or had never left, and he decided not to ask which. "I have the grid revision," he said, setting the legal pad open on the table. She looked at it without touching it. "Read the 6 pages in the particular scanning way that engineers read technical specifications, not word by word but structure first, looking for the load-bearing decisions. After 4 minutes, she said, "The divergence point at narrow column is at 60%. Yes. That's not where I'd have put it. Where would you have put it? 55. More aggressive departure from the print logic at the smaller sizes gives the digital applications more room." He considered it. "What does that cost you at the implementation level?" "It costs me some consistency in the mid-range. The transition between the two logics is less smooth." Is the mid-range an important application context for Harmon? She thought about it. Tablet. They have a substantial tablet readership. How substantial? I'd have to check the brief, but Elise said something about it in the first briefing. I think it was in the demographics section. He flipped through his own notes until he found Elise's reference. Tablet was 23% of their digital readership, the smallest segment, well below desktop and mobile. He looked at the numbers and then at the grid logic and ran the trade-off. 60 holds, he said. Tablet at 23% doesn't justify the mid-range inconsistency cost. D looked at the number. Okay, but flag it in the documentation. If their tablet numbers change in 2 years, they need to know there's a decision point there that can be revisited. She wrote that down. The rest of the grid holds? The rest of the grid is clean, she said. I was up until midnight building test applications. It works. He looked at her. How much sleep did you get? Enough. That's not an answer. 4 hours. She said it the way you say something that you know sounds bad, but that you've made peace with. I wanted to see the grid work before I came in. Otherwise, I'd be sitting here thinking about it instead of being useful. He understood that completely. He didn't tell her she should have slept more. When Priya gets here, show her the test applications, he said. I want her assessment before we lock the grid. I can do that. Sam. Priya arrived at 7 on the dot, which he had come to understand was her standard. Not early, not late. As though she found lateness disrespectful, and early arrival performative, and had made a decision to occupy only the exact appointed moment. She came in, looked at the room, looked at him and Dee, and said, What happened while I was gone? Grid revision is done, Adrian said. Dee has the test applications. I need your read before we lock. Okay. She set her bag down, poured coffee, and came to the table without removing her coat for another 5 minutes, which was a detail Adrian noticed because it was the kind of thing that revealed something. She ran cold, or she'd walked fast and hadn't cooled down yet, or she was the kind of person who needed a few minutes of physical transition before she was fully in a space. He watched Dee walk Priya through the test applications. He stayed out of it, partly because his read was already decided and he didn't want to influence Priya's before she had it, and partly because watching two technically competent people examine work was one of the more instructive things you could do in a design process. What they noticed told you what the work was actually communicating versus what you intended it to communicate. Priya asked 3 questions. Dee answered 2 of them confidently and the third with a qualifier, which was the honest way to answer a question you were 90% sure of. At the end, Priya looked at Adrian. It's right, she said. The 60% divergence point works better than I expected. The narrow column digital applications are actually cleaner than what we had before. Because the old system was trying to maintain too much consistency at the cost of usability, Adrian said. The divergence isn't a flaw, it's a decision. That's a good line for the usage documentation. Write it in. She sat down and started typing. Sam arrived 12 minutes later, shed his jacket, looked at the coffee carafe with visible relief, poured a cup, and said, Are we on schedule? Yes. Components today? Components today. He said it with more certainty than he strictly felt, because this was the part of the timeline that had the least margin. The type system was locked. The color system was locked. The grid was locked. The component library was the most labor-intensive section. It was where the abstract decisions of the foundation layers became concrete, buildable pieces, and where most of the actual production work lived. They had today and the first half of tomorrow to complete it, because the second half of tomorrow was documentation review, and the morning of the presentation day was final prep. It was tight. He knew it was tight, and he knew that tight timelines produced one of 2 things, focused work or panicked work, and the difference between them was whether the people in the room trusted the structure they were operating inside. He had been careful over the past 2 days to make decisions clearly and document them thoroughly, precisely because he knew this moment was coming. The moment when the team would need to move fast, and moving fast required having done the slow work correctly at the front. Here's how we divide it, he said, and he walked them through the component allocation. Which pieces D would own, which Sam would build, which Priya would architect and then hand off, which he would spec directly because they were the ones where the decisions were still being made rather than already made. He did it in about 8 minutes with the legal pad open, pointing at sections. Nobody questioned it. Nobody offered an alternative structure. They picked up their assignments and started working, which was, in his experience, the best possible outcome of that kind of meeting. Elise appeared at 10 a.m. with 2 things: the latest communication from Richard Holt's office and a look on her face that straddled the line between professionally composed and personally stressed. "Holt wants a call," she said. "He's heard something from somewhere. He's not specific about what, but he's asking pointed questions about whether the project is still on track in a way that suggests he thinks it might not be." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd confirm a call time with our team and get back to him by noon." She paused. "Victoria thinks we should let her take the call." "What do you think?" Elise was quiet for a second, in the way that people are quiet when they have a clear opinion and are deciding whether it's their place to say it. "I think Holt trusts me more than he trusts Victoria, with no disrespect to Victoria, because I've been his primary contact for 2 years, and we have an actual relationship. I think a call from Victoria signals that something serious happened, which is the one thing we can't confirm right now." "Then you take the call." "And what do I tell him?" Adrian thought about it. "The truth, without the specifics. Tell him there was an internal personnel situation that affected the project workflow. Tell him it was addressed immediately. Tell him the creative direction has been strengthened as a result." He paused. "That last part isn't spin. It's accurate." Elise looked at him. "Is it? Stronger than what was being developed before?" "Yes." She held his eyes for a moment, checking, and seemed to find what she was looking for. "Okay." She wrote something in her folio. "He's going to ask who's leading the creative work now. Tell him there's been a creative direction change that you'll walk him through in the presentation." "He won't like waiting." "He'll like the presentation." Adrian said it without bravado, as a statement of structural fact. What's in this room right now is the right answer to his question. He'll know that when he sees it. Elise capped her pen. "You're either very confident or very good at performing confidence." "I've built enough systems to know when one is working. This one is working." She nodded once, the decision made, and left to arrange the call. Sam, from across the table, said without looking up, "That was smooth." "I meant it." "I know. That's what made it smooth." The component work was harder than the foundation work in the way that all implementation is harder than architecture. It required sustained, detailed attention at a level of specificity that was both cognitively demanding and unglamorous. They were building the vocabulary of the system, the specific way a headline would sit above a body copy block, the precise relationship between an image and its caption, the behavior of a pull quote on the page, the structural logic of a dateline, the way section dividers would work at different scales, the navigation hierarchy, and how it would communicate authority without feeling bureaucratic. Adrian moved between the team members through the morning, not hovering, but checking in with each one at intervals, answering questions when they had them, making decisions when decisions were needed. He'd worked in enough design environments to know that the creative lead's job in implementation was primarily to be a decision maker rather than a builder, to absorb the questions and return answers fast enough that the builders could keep moving rather than accumulating blockers. He was good at this. He'd always been good at it. Faster than most people were comfortable with, though he'd learned over years that the discomfort was usually about the speed of decision-making rather than the quality of the decisions, and that the way to manage it was to be transparent about the reasoning. At 11:30, Sam ran into a problem. "The pull quote component," he said. "I'm trying to make it work at 3 different column widths, and there's a weight issue at the narrow width. The rule weight that looks right at full column looks too heavy at narrow." Adrian came around the table and looked at Sam's screen. The problem was exactly what Sam described. A horizontal rule above the pull quote that was set at a weight appropriate for the full column layout and was reading as aggressive at the narrow application. "Can you split the rule weight logic by breakpoint?" "In print, no. It's a single document. It's a single document, but the narrow column is a distinct application. Set it as an alternate specification, not a breakpoint. Print application A and print application B. Sam frowned. Does that add documentation complexity? Yes. Is it the right decision? Sam looked at the screen. Yes. Then it adds documentation complexity, and we document it clearly. He paused. Design that hides its own complexity to make the documentation look clean is design that falls apart in practice. The documentation should be honest about what the system actually requires. Sam made a note and went back to the component. This was, Adrian thought, the kind of conversation that happened in implementations and that nobody who wasn't in the room ever saw. The decisions that looked like small technical footnotes and were actually load-bearing. The places where the system either held up under real conditions or revealed that it had been built for ideal conditions that didn't exist. The honest answer to a hard problem was always more important than the clean answer. At 2 p.m., Elise came back from the Holt call. She came into the conference room and didn't say anything immediately, which made Adrian stop what he was doing and look at her. "How did it go?" he said. "He asked me directly if Darren Cross was still on the project." A pause. "What did you tell him?" "I told him there had been a creative leadership change and that the current direction was stronger." She sat down. He said, and I'm quoting directly because I've been replaying it, "Elise, I've been through 2 of these. I know when I'm being managed. I'm asking you straight, is this going to be ready?" And I told him yes. I told him the person leading the creative work now built the Meridian Identity System in 2015 and the Atlas Financial System in 2012. She looked at Adrian. "I hope you don't mind, I used your actual background." He minded slightly and then let it go. "What did he say?" He was quiet for about 4 seconds, which is a long time on a phone call. Then he said, "The Atlas system. Somebody did their homework." And then he said he'd see us Friday. "That's it?" "That's it." She exhaled. "I've been on calls with Richard Holt for 2 years, and I've never heard him say anything that direct. He usually circles a point about 6 times before landing on it." She looked at the table. "I think he's actually looking forward to Friday," which is not the usual pre-presentation dynamic with this client. Adrian went back to his screen. "Good. Is that all you have to say?" "What else is there to say?" "He's coming. The work has to be there when he arrives." Elise looked at him for a moment with an expression that he'd seen a few times now on different faces in this building. Something that was trying to decide whether he was genuinely unaffected by the things that affected everyone else, or whether he had just gotten very good at not showing it. Both, he could have told her. Both things at once, which was not the same as neither. Correct. The investigation findings came through at 4 p.m. Victoria walked in with the summary and handed it to Adrian without preamble, which he appreciated. He read it while she stood near the window. It was thorough. The forensics had reconstructed the sequence with enough specificity to produce a timeline that was, in its way, almost clinical in what it revealed. Darren had begun setting up the infrastructure for the file deletion 9 days before it happened. The proxy email account had been created during a period when he had known, through access to the project management system that his role gave him, that the Harmon timeline was about to compress significantly, that the final system would need to be in a state of completion within 3 weeks rather than the original 5. The working theory the investigation had developed, which Darren's attorney had neither confirmed nor denied in any useful way, was that the original plan had not been deletion. The original plan had been to position himself as the only person capable of completing the project under the compressed timeline, to create a crisis that elevated his indispensability. The deletion had been a contingency, planned but not necessarily intended as the primary move. What had changed was the cleaning incident. Adrian had given him an opportunity he hadn't anticipated and hadn't been able to resist. A 15-second clip that, framed correctly, provided a ready-made scapegoat for any subsequent crisis. A pre-existing anxiety in Victoria about project security, inflamed at exactly the right moment. A cause that could be applied retroactively to a planned effect. It had failed because the timeline was too compressed. He'd needed more distance between the incident and the deletion and the investigation. As it was, the sequence was tight enough that the connections were visible as soon as anyone looked carefully. Adrian set the summary down. He built real things, Adrian said. Victoria looked at him. I want to be accurate about it, he said. What the backup contains, the foundational thinking that I've been building from, that's real work. It's not the right direction for the client, but it's competent foundational work. He didn't get to where he got by being entirely without talent. That's a generous read. It's an accurate read. Generous would be excusing the rest of it. He put the summary on the table beside his legal pad. What happens to him is a legal and HR matter. What matters to me is that the work in this room is the work, not what he did, not the story around it. Victoria was quiet for a moment. The board is going to move to terminate his contract formally tomorrow. That's appropriate. There may be legal proceedings. He's not the only one who has liability exposure here. She said the last part with a slight weight to it that indicated she was including herself in that category. I know. I'm telling you because the story may become public. The Harmon client may hear a version of it before Friday. Then Elise should prepare for that conversation, Adrian said. But the answer to a public story is always the same thing, the work. If the work is good enough, the story becomes a footnote. You sound very certain of that. I've seen it go both ways, he said. I've seen companies survive bad press because their product was undeniably good. I've seen companies with good press fail because their product was hollow. He looked at the screen. The work is the only thing I can control, so that's what I'm focused on. She looked at him for a long moment. I owe you more than a contract and an apology, you know. You owe me exactly what the contract says you owe me, he said. The apology was separate. We're even on that. She almost smiled. You're very precise about things. It's useful. She left, and he went back to the component library. The last 3 hours of day 3 were the hardest. Not because anything went wrong. Nothing went wrong, which in a project under this kind of pressure was itself a minor daily miracle. But the cumulative weight of 3 days of sustained concentration was starting to show in the room. Sam's sentences were getting shorter. Dee was correcting the same line of code for the 3rd time. Priya had developed the particular set of her jaw that indicated she was holding herself together by will rather than by reserves. Adrian was tired too. He didn't perform otherwise because he'd learned that performing energy you didn't have was a fast path to mistakes, and mistakes at this stage were expensive. He called it at 9:30. Stop, he said. They stopped. 3 faces looked at him with varying degrees of relief and wariness. What's done is done, he said. What isn't done is not going to get done well tonight. We're close enough on the component library that tomorrow morning with clear heads is better than another 2 hours tonight with depleted ones. How close is close enough, Priya said. I need 4 more components completed and 2 existing ones revised. That's a morning's work if we start at 7 and are focused. And the afternoon? Documentation review. I need every section of the system documentation checked for internal consistency. Not for content? I'll handle content. For consistency. If the type documentation says the scale is 1.25 and the component documentation references a different number, that's the kind of error that a client's in-house team finds on day 1 of implementation, and that makes the whole system look sloppy. Dee said, I can do consistency review. Yes, you and Sam working separately, then compare flags. Priya, I need you on the component revisions with me first thing tomorrow. We need to talk through the 2 navigation components before we touch the files. Priya nodded. 7. They packed up. Sam said goodnight and meant it. Not performatively, not closing a meeting, just a genuine acknowledgement that the day had been long and he was tired. Dee said nothing, which was her standard mode of departure, and which he'd come to find oddly comforting in its consistency. Priya paused at the door. We're going to make it, she said. Not a question, but not fully a statement either. Something in between. A reading of the situation offered to the room to see if he agreed. Yes, he said. She left. He sat alone for a while. He did this at the end of each day. Sat alone with what had been built and looked at it honestly, because the work looked different when the room was empty. The presence of other people, even quiet-focused people, created a kind of energy that could carry you past problems. And he wanted to see the work without that energy, wanted to know what it felt like when nobody was there to make it feel better than it was. He went through the component library files slowly. He went through the color documentation. He went through the type system, the grid logic, the foundational architecture. It was good, not finished, not quite what it needed to be yet. But the structure was sound. The decisions were defensible. The internal logic was consistent in the way that the best systems were consistent, not through rigidity, but through a coherent underlying principle that made each decision feel like a natural consequence of the ones before it. It was, he thought, better than what had been deleted. Not by a catastrophic margin, not in every detail, but structurally better, cleaner, more honest, more precisely calibrated to what the client actually needed, rather than to what would impress in a portfolio. That was partly because he knew what he was doing. But it was also partly because starting from scratch, under constraint, with no time to second guess, had forced the kind of decisiveness that long timelines with committee review tended to erode. Pressure had a clarifying function when you didn't panic. He turned off the laptops, closed the legal pad, put his jacket on. On the way out, he passed the 41st floor. He didn't go in. He stood in the corridor for a moment, looking through the glass at the darkened bullpen, the drafting tables, the tack boards, the dying tropical plant by the reception desk still shedding its long leaves. The cleaning cart was visible near the far stairwell, parked between sessions. He looked at it. The bad wheel. The slight left pull that you learned to correct for. He thought about the first morning he'd brought that cart down this corridor, and the hundreds of mornings after it, and the 447 view of the lake. He thought about what it had given him, the structure, the silence, the 6 years of becoming a person who knew how to work without needing to perform the working. That person was still him. Whatever happened with the Harmon presentation, whatever came after it, the 6 years had happened, and the 6 years were inside the work he was doing now. Not despite the gray uniform and the bad wheel cart. Because of them. He turned away from the window and walked to the elevator. Tomorrow was the last day. The presentation was Friday morning, 9 a.m., Harmon's team coming into the Asterion boardroom on 42, which meant Thursday was documentation, Thursday was the final review, Thursday was the moment where whatever wasn't done either got done or didn't, and either the system was ready to stand in front of a skeptical client who had rejected 2 of these before, or it wasn't. He thought about Richard Holt saying, "Trusted in the way you say a word that carries the weight of something you've protected for a long time." 30 years of being the paper of record. 30 years of readers who came back not because Harmon was exciting or innovative or visually bold, but because Harmon told the truth. You couldn't design trust. You couldn't put it on a page with a typeface and a color system and a grid and have it suddenly exist where it hadn't before. What you could do, the only thing you could do, if you were doing it right, was build a system that didn't lie about what the company was. A system that looked like what was true. That was what was sitting in the files on the 41st floor's shared server right now, or would be by tomorrow evening. He pressed the lobby button in the elevator. The doors closed. He rode down 41 floors through the quiet building, past all the floors he knew by feel, and came out into the night. 4 hours of sleep. Back at 7. He walked to the train. Thursday arrived the way the last day of anything difficult arrives, with a specific quality of light that feels both ordinary and weighted, the world going about its business with no awareness that something is about to either hold or break. Adrian was on the train by 6:15. He'd slept 5 hours, which was more than the previous nights. And he'd woken up at 5 a.m. not from an alarm but from his brain, deciding it was done resting and wanted to get back to the problem. He lay in the dark for 20 minutes going through the component list in his head. Not anxiously, just checking. The way you check the locks before you leave a house. Not because you think you forgot, but because the checking is its own form of care. Everything was there. Everything he'd built this week was sitting in his memory in the specific, organized way that work you've made with your hands and your full attention gets stored. Not like a list you memorized, but like a place you've been. He could move through it room by room. He got up, made coffee, ate standing at the counter, and was out the door before the city was properly awake. On the train, he did something he hadn't done all week. He opened the sketchbook. Not to work in it, just to look. He turned through the pages slowly, standing in the car with one hand on the overhead bar, the book held in his other hand. The lettering studies Hess had mentioned. Some compositional sketches from the Tuesday drawing class at the community center, rough and searching, The kind of work that wasn't for anyone but himself. A series of type explorations he'd done 3 weeks ago on a Sunday afternoon with no particular project in mind, just the pleasure of the thing. He closed the sketchbook and put it back in his bag. He thought about what it meant that he'd kept it in his locker at Asterion for 6 months. He hadn't examined the reasoning at the time. It had felt like a practical decision, keeping his personal materials in the place where he spent most of his waking hours. But sitting in the train car going east toward the lake, he understood it more honestly. He'd kept it there because some part of him had always known that the two halves of what he was hadn't separated as cleanly as he'd told himself. The man who pushed the cleaning cart and the man who filled the sketchbook with type studies on Sunday afternoons were the same man, and some part of him had refused to let them live in entirely separate places. The sketchbook was a foot in the door. Priya had been right about that. He hadn't been invisible all the way down, was the thing. He'd just been waiting, in the specific patient way of someone who has learned that things reveal themselves in their own time, for the moment when that stopped being the right choice. Priya was there at 7. Dee was there at 7. Sam arrived at 7:03 and looked like he'd slept well, which Adrian was glad about because Sam's energy was a barometer for the room, and a well-rested Sam was an asset. "Navigation components," Adrian said to Priya before she'd finished pouring her coffee. "Good morning to you too," she said. "Good morning. Navigation components." She sat down. "Both of them are structurally done. The issue is the secondary navigation, the section hierarchy. It works visually, but I'm not sure it works conceptually for Harmon. They have a deep section structure. 15 categories of coverage. The secondary nav has to communicate hierarchy without creating visual noise." "Show me." She pulled it up on her screen. He looked at it for a while, and she let him look without talking, which was one of the things he had come to value about working with her. She understood that his looking was its own process, and that interrupting it with explanation was counterproductive. The component was technically sound, the visual hierarchy was clear, and she was right that something was off. It took him 4 minutes to identify it. The section labels are set at the same weight as the navigation itself. Yes. They shouldn't be. The navigation is structural. It's how you move through the publication. The section labels are editorial. They're how you orient within it. Those are different functions and they need different visual weight. If I drop the section label weight, they might get lost against the body copy. Not if you use the color system correctly. Section labels in the secondary application of the primary color. Navigation in the base typographic color. They'll differentiate without the section labels weakening. Priya stared at the screen for a moment. Then she opened the file and made the change. It took her 3 minutes. She looked at the result. "That's it," she said. "Yes. I was close. You were right that something was wrong. That's the harder part." She made a small, dry sound that was almost a laugh. "You're oddly good at giving compliments that don't feel like compliments." It was a compliment. "I know." She kept working. The second navigation component was simpler and resolved in 20 minutes. By 8:30, the 4 remaining components were completed. The last 2 by Sam and Dee working in parallel, both of them finding their rhythm in the way that people find rhythm on the last stretch of something difficult, the end close enough to pull you forward. By 9:15, the component library was done. Adrian sat back in his chair and looked at the files on the screen. "That's the build," he said. The room was quiet for a moment. Not a dramatic quiet. Nobody put down their tools or exhaled dramatically or made any gesture toward the occasion. But there was a brief pause, the way there's a pause when you've been carrying something and you set it down, and the air around you is different for a second before the next thing starts. "Documentation review," Priya said. "Documentation review," he confirmed. Dee and Sam took the documentation. He'd been clear about the methodology, not reading for content, reading for consistency. Checking that every number referenced in one section matched every number referenced in every other section. Checking that the naming conventions were consistent, that a component called one thing in the type documentation wasn't called something slightly different in the grid documentation. Checking that the usage examples matched the specifications. It was painstaking work, and it was the kind of work that the people who did the creative work often failed to value appropriately because it wasn't creative. It was editorial. It was the difference between a system that looked good in a presentation and a system that worked correctly when handed to a team of people who hadn't been in the room when it was built. While they worked, Adrian did the one remaining thing he'd saved for last. He wrote the system introduction. Every identity system needed one, a document, usually 3 to 5 pages, that explained not the mechanics of the system, but the thinking behind it, the decisions and their reasoning, the intent, the principles that should guide application when the documentation didn't have a specific answer for a specific situation. Most agencies produce these as marketing documents, polished and vague, full of language about vision and purpose that sounded resonant and meant nothing when you needed to make a real decision. He'd always written them differently. He wrote them as honest accounts of why specific choices had been made, direct, declarative, without decoration. Written for the person who would be working with the system 2 years from now, when he was long gone, who needed to understand the reasoning well enough to extend it correctly, not just follow the rules. He wrote the Harmon introduction by hand first, in the legal pad, the way he'd written everything this week. 8 pages. He crossed out one section and rewrote it, the part about what the red was intended to communicate, which he'd gotten right on the second try. He wrote about what trusted looked like when you translated it into a visual language. He wrote about the grid's relationship to print as primary and what that reflected about Harmon's identity. He wrote about why the type decision was the type decision, not abstractly but specifically, with the reasoning laid out so clearly that you could follow it and either agree or disagree on informed grounds. He did not write about Darren Cross. He did not write about the deletion or the crisis or the 4 days it had taken to build the system. He wrote about Harmon. That was what the document was for. At 12:30, Dee brought him a flag. The color documentation references a line weight of 0.5 points in 3 places, she said. The component documentation references 0.75 point in 2 of those same applications. Which is correct? Based on the test application, 0.5 is correct. The 0.75 came from an earlier draft of the component specs that didn't get updated when you revised the color documentation. Fix it and note it in the change log. She went back to her section. Sam brought him 2 more flags over the next hour, both of them minor. A naming inconsistency in the secondary color palette and a missing cross-reference in the grid documentation. He resolved both immediately. By 2 p.m., Dee and Sam had cleared the full documentation without any remaining flags. The system was internally consistent. Adrian read the type introduction one more time, then opened a new document on the laptop and typed it in clean. He read it again on screen, which was different from reading it on paper. The screen showed you different things, and he trusted both readings together more than either one alone. He made 2 small adjustments to the phrasing. The rest held. He was done. He sat with that for a moment without announcing it. Priya noticed before he said anything. She looked up from her screen, looked at his face, and said, "You finished the introduction." "Yes." She looked at the time on her laptop. "It's 2:17. "Yes." "We have a 17-hour buffer before the presentation. We have time for one full review pass of the complete system," he said. "Everything in sequence, beginning to end. I want to go through it the way Holt will see it, not as individual pieces, but as a complete system, to make sure the whole says what the parts are supposed to say." "When?" "Now. All 4 of us, together." They did it over the next 3 hours, and it was the part of the week that Adrian would remember most clearly afterward. Not the decisions or the pressure or the long nights, but this. The 4 of them sitting around the table, going through the system page by page, document by document, component by component, not as a committee reviewing for approval, but as a team checking the work they'd built together against the standard they'd all been holding in their heads all week. There were 2 small things they changed. Sam caught a spacing irregularity in one component that hadn't shown up in Dee's consistency review because it was a visual judgment rather than a numerical one. Priya identified a usage example that, on close review, showed the type system in a context that wasn't representative of how Harmon would actually apply it. Both things were fixed in less than an hour. At 5:30, Adrian closed the last document. "That's it," he said. "The system is done." Nobody performed a reaction. They were too tired and too steady for performance. What happened instead was quieter and more real. Sam leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with his eyes closed. Dee shut her laptop with the care of someone handling something finished. Priya put her pen down and left her hand flat on the table, a small physical acknowledgement. Adrian looked at the window. The lake was doing what it did in late October at this hour, going dark and flat, the light coming off it at a low angle that turned everything a particular blue-gray that belonged to this city in this season and no other. "I want to say something," Sam said. Everyone looked at him. "I know you probably don't want a speech," Sam said to Adrian, "and I'm not going to give one, but I've been doing design work for 4 years and I've never seen anyone work the way you worked this week. Not faster. I don't mean faster. I mean..." He stopped, searched for it. Like every decision was connected to every other decision, like it was all one thing. Adrian didn't say anything for a moment. "That's what a system is supposed to be," he said. "One thing, not a collection of parts that look good together. One coherent thing that happens to be expressed in different ways in different places." He paused. "Most of the time, you don't have time to build it properly. You compromise on the coherence because of the timeline, or the budget, or the committee, and you end up with something that's close but not quite one thing." He looked at the closed laptops. This week, the pressure came from a different direction and it produced a different result. Meaning? Meaning we didn't have time for the compromises, which turned out to be useful. Sam seemed to think about that for a while. "That's a strange way to describe one of the worst weeks of my professional life." It was a strange week. Dee, who had been quiet through all of this, said, "It was a good week." Just that. No qualification. Victoria came down at 6 p.m. She'd been apprised of the completion through Janet, and she came to the conference room with the same directness she'd brought to everything. No ceremony, no performance of arrival. She sat down across from Adrian, and he walked her through the system in 25 minutes, the same way he'd walk Holt through it in the morning, because he wanted her to know what she was presenting before she was in the room with the client. She was a good audience. She asked 3 questions, all of them sharp, and he answered all 3 without hedging. When he showed her the system introduction, the document he'd written last, she read it in silence and read it slowly, which told him she was actually reading rather than scanning. When she finished, she put it down. "You wrote this for the person who's going to implement this in 2 years, she said, "not for the presentation." "Yes." "Holt is going to notice that. I'm counting on it." She looked at the documentation spread across the table. The full system, built in 4 days. 3.5. Does that ever feel extraordinary to you? What you can do? He considered the question honestly because she deserved an honest answer and because it wasn't a simple question. "No," he said. "It feels like what it is. Years of practice at a specific skill set. The speed isn't magic, it's compression. I've made most of these decisions before, in other projects, in other configurations. I'm not inventing from nothing. I'm drawing on a large body of resolved problems." "You're being modest." "I'm being accurate." He paused. "The extraordinary part, if there is one, is that the team in this room made it possible. I could spec the decisions, but I couldn't build the files, run the consistency review, and write the documentation simultaneously. That was 4 people. Victoria looked at him for a moment. "I want to discuss what comes after Friday." He'd been expecting this. "After Friday," he said, "I want to offer you a formal role, not cleaning staff, not a temporary contract." She said it directly, which he appreciated. "Senior creative lead, permanent if you want it, full salary, commensurate with your level, authorship attribution on all projects you lead." She paused. "The terms you set at the beginning of the week as your conditions. I want to make those the standing terms of your employment." He was quiet. "I don't need an answer today," she said. "Or this week, after the presentation, when things are settled. I appreciate that. But I want you to know the offer is serious, not a gesture." He looked at the window, at the dark lake beyond the glass. He thought about his apartment on Kedzie, the small table, the lamp making its circle of yellow light, the Tuesday evenings at the community center. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking." She gathered herself to leave, then stopped. "The man you were this week," she said carefully, "was he different from the man you were 6 years ago?" He thought about it for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "quieter. Less interested in being right in front of other people. More interested in the work being right in itself. Is that better?" "I think so." I'm not sure it would have produced this system 6 years ago. 6 years ago, I would have been trying to impress Holt. This week, I was trying to answer his question. He paused. Those aren't the same thing, and the difference shows up in the work. Victoria nodded once, the way she nodded when something settled correctly. Then she left. Much met. Friday morning came in cold and clear. The kind of Chicago October morning that had no ambivalence in it. The sky was a hard blue. The lake was running white at the caps. The wind off the water had real teeth. Adrian walked from the Clark and Lake Station to the Asterion building at 8:15 with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath visible in the air and the city loud and awake around him. He felt for the first time all week something close to calm. Not the performed calm of someone managing anxiety. The real thing. The specific stillness that comes when you've done the work, and the work is done, and all that's left is to let it speak. He had built what he'd set out to build. Whatever happened in the room in 45 minutes, he couldn't change the system now. It was what it was. It would either land or it wouldn't, and standing in the street worrying about it was not going to alter either outcome. He went up to 42. Priya and Sam and Dee were already there in the boardroom, doing the final check of the presentation setup. The room had been prepared by Janet's team overnight. The large display screen at the far end showing the Asterion holding slide. The table arranged for a 10-person meeting, water and coffee on the credenza. Everything working? Adrian said. Everything's working, Sam said. I checked the display twice. Dee checked it once. It's working. Dee looked at Adrian. Are you nervous? No. I am, she said. Not with complaint, that's just reporting a fact. That's okay. It doesn't feel okay. It means you care about the work. That's appropriate. He looked at her. But the work doesn't get better or worse based on what we feel about it right now. It's done. What happens in this room is just the moment when someone else finds out what we already know. She thought about that. That's a useful way to frame it. I've been in a lot of these rooms. That's the frame that works. The Harmon team arrived at 8:55. Richard Holt was smaller than Adrian had expected. Not physically exactly, but in the way of people who carry significant authority quietly, without mass. He was in his early 60s, in a dark suit, with the kind of face that had lines in it from paying attention to things rather than from strain. He came in with 2 members of his team and shook hands around the room with the brisk, unelaborated courtesy of someone who didn't see the point of extended social ceremony. When he got to Adrian, he stopped for a half-second longer than he'd stopped for anyone else. A J. Coleman, Holt said. Not as a greeting, more like reading something off a page to confirm it was there. Adrian Cole, Adrian said. I changed my name. I know. Holt held his hand a beat longer than necessary. I've used the Atlas system as a case study internally. For the past 3 years, whenever someone on my team asks what a well-built identity system looks like, I send them the Atlas documentation. He let go of his hand. Elise said you'd been away from the industry. For a while. What brought you back? A specific problem that needed solving. Something in Holt's expression shifted. Not warmly, not to performance, but to focus. The expression of someone who has just gotten a piece of information that confirms a working hypothesis. All right, he said. Let's see it. That Adrian presented the system himself. Not because it was expected, not to claim credit in front of the room, but because the system had a logic and he understood the logic better than anyone else in the room, and a system presented by someone who doesn't understand it gets halfway explained. He'd spent a career watching design work fail in presentation because the person presenting was selling rather than explaining, and the client could feel the difference even when they couldn't name it. He started with the introduction document. He handed printed copies to Holt and his team, and he stood at the front of the room and gave them 4 minutes to read it, and he did not talk while they read. The room was quiet. Victoria, sitting along the side wall, watched Holt's face while he read. Elise sat 2 seats from Holt and watched the table. Holt finished reading and set the document down and looked at Adrian. You wrote this? Yes. It doesn't sound like an agency document. It's not. It's a working document. For your team. For 2 years from now when someone needs to know why a decision was made and there's no one left to ask. Holt looked at the document again. The line about trust, he said. Where you write that trust in visual language isn't built by looking trustworthy. It's built by not looking like anything else. He paused. That's the thing neither agency got right. They were both trying to look trustworthy. They were designing the appearance of it. Right. And your position is that the appearance is wrong. My position is that Harmon already has the substance. The system's job is to stop obscuring it. Holt sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." Adrian walked them through it. He started with the type system, then the color, then the grid, then the components, in the sequence that showed how each decision was a consequence of the decision before it, how the whole was not a collection of parts that had been aesthetically harmonized, but a single coherent logic expressed across different surfaces. He talked about the red. He explained the print primary grid. He showed how the navigation hierarchy solved the problem of Harmon's deep section structure without creating visual noise. He put up the usage examples, and the examples did what good usage examples do. They made the abstract decisions visible in the real context of how the system would actually be applied. Holt's team asked questions. Technical questions, specific questions, the kind that came from people who had been through this process before and knew where the gaps usually appeared. Adrian answered every one of them directly, without hedging, and on 2 occasions said, "Good question. Here's where that's handled in the documentation," rather than answering off the top of his head, because the documentation was built to answer exactly those questions, and using it in the room demonstrated its usefulness. Holt himself said very little for the first 40 minutes. Then, at minute 42, during a section on the component library, he said, "Stop." Everyone stopped. "Go back to the section divider component." Adrian went back. Holt looked at it for a long moment. "My editorial director is going to ask about this. She's very particular about how section transitions work in print. She's going to say this is cleaner than what we have. It's meant to be. She's going to want to know if it can be applied retroactively to the existing print template." "The documentation has a migration section," Adrian said. He pulled it up. "We built a transition guide specifically for implementing the new system over existing layouts without requiring a full redesign of every template simultaneously. Your team can move section by section." Holt's editorial director, who had come as part of his team and had been making quiet notes throughout, looked up from her notepad at the migration section on the screen. That addresses something we've been worried about." "I know," Adrian said. "Elise mentioned it during our prep." Holt looked at Elise, who gave a small, composed nod. He looked back at Adrian. "You built the migration guide because Elise flagged the operational concern." "Yes. And it's fully documented." Page 41 of the system documentation. Holt was quiet for a moment. "I've sat through a lot of these presentations," he said. "Twice with this particular project." He looked at the screen where the section divider component was still visible. The first time, the agency came in with something that looked like it had been designed for a different company entirely. The second time, the agency came in with something safe enough to hang wallpaper with. He paused. "This looks like Harmon." The room was quiet. "I mean that as specifically as it sounds," Holt said, "not as a compliment about the aesthetics. I mean that I'm looking at this and I see my company. I see what we've been for 30 years, which is what I've been trying to say in meetings and briefs for 6 years, and not managing to say in a way that produces this." He picked up the system introduction document again, briefly. "How soon can your team have the full handoff package ready?" Elise glanced at Adrian. 2 weeks, Adrian said. "Complete system documentation, the migration guide, the digital application specs, and an implementation briefing for your in-house team." Holt looked at his editorial director. She nodded once. "All right," Holt said. "Let's talk contract." Afterward, in the corridor outside the boardroom, Victoria stood next to Adrian while the Harmon team was escorted to the conference room on 41 for the contract discussion. The building was going about its morning around them, the sounds of a functioning company, phones and conversation, and the distant machinery of a place where work happened. "He said it looks like Harmon," Victoria said. "Yes. That's the thing you said would happen. It's what the system was built to do." She was quiet for a moment. "How does it feel?" He thought about that honestly. Not the polished version of how it felt, but the actual thing. It feels like it was worth the week, he said, which is not nothing. It's more than not nothing. Maybe. He watched a junior account manager come out of a side office and hurry past them with a folder under her arm, too purposeful to notice them standing there. But I try not to let the landing inflate the flight. The work was what it was before Holt approved it. His approval doesn't make it better. It confirms that I read the problem correctly. You always think about it that way? I think about it that way now. 6 years ago, I needed the approval more than I needed to read the problem correctly. He paused. That was backwards. It took me a while to figure out which direction it was supposed to go. Victoria looked at him. The offer stands, she said. However you want to think about it, at whatever pace. I know. He looked out the window at the end of the corridor. The lake, which was always there, which was always indifferent, which did not adjust itself based on what was happening in the building. I'll let you know. He picked up his bag and his legal pad, and he took the elevator down. But bumped it. Not the blue line, not this time. He walked. He walked the 3 miles from the Asterian building to his apartment on Kedzie, through the loop and across the river and west through neighborhoods he knew, past the coffee shop on Chicago Avenue where he sometimes sat on Saturday mornings, past the hardware store on Milwaukee where he'd bought a replacement washer for his kitchen sink 2 months ago, past the community center where the Tuesday drawing class met in the low-ceilinged room on the second floor with the bad heating and the good light. He walked the way you walk when you have time and nowhere to be, which he hadn't had since Monday morning when his phone had rung at his kitchen table with the tea going cold. He thought about what he'd said to Victoria. It feels like it was worth the week. That was true, but it was incomplete. The week had been worth it in the obvious ways. The work was good, the client had approved it, the company had been pulled back from a significant crisis. Those were real outcomes, and he didn't discount them. But there was something else, something he hadn't said and hadn't fully articulated even to himself until he was walking west on Chicago Avenue with the cold air off the lake thinning behind him and the neighborhood getting quieter around him. The week had reminded him of something he'd known before he forgot it. Not that he was good at this. He'd known that. In the remote, objective way you can know a fact about yourself without it meaning much. He'd known he was good at building systems the way he knew he was right-handed, factually, without weight. What the week had reminded him was why it mattered. Not for career reasons, not for money or recognition or the approval of a skeptical client who said, "This looks like Harmon in a conference room 42 floors above the lake." Those things were real, but they were not the reason. The reason was Richard Holt's editorial director writing notes in her pad at minute 23 when the section divider component went up on the screen. The reason was Priya saying I was close and meaning it as a real assessment rather than false modesty. The reason was Dee putting her hand flat on the table when the last document closed. The reason was Sam on a Tuesday evening saying, "This is a weird way to spend a Tuesday evening," and then staying anyway. The reason was the sketchbook in his bag, which had been kept for 6 years at a cleaning job, not because he had a plan for it, but because some part of him had always understood that what you were did not go away when you stopped doing it in public. It went underground. It went quiet. It waited, with a patience that was not resignation, but was something closer to faith in time. Not the religious kind, but the ordinary human kind, the kind that says, there will be a moment when this is needed again, and when it comes, be ready. He had been ready, not because the 6 years had been wasted, because the 6 years had been the readiness, the cleaning work, the structure, the silence. The early mornings with the lake going flat and gray beyond the glass, none of it had been aside from who he was. It had been part of it. The grief of his sister's death, which he had never talked about in the Asterion building and would not now, that had been part of it too. The way grief changes you, not by diminishing what was there before, but by adding a layer of seriousness to it, a refusal to spend the finite time you have on things that don't matter, that had been present in every decision he'd made this week. He was not the same person who had left the industry 6 years ago, but he was not a different person either. He was the same person, changed by time and experience, which was the only way anyone became anything. He thought about Victoria's offer. He had not said yes, and he had not said no, and he had meant it when he said he'd think about it. He was thinking about it now, on Chicago Avenue, with the wind pushing at his back and the apartment still 8 blocks ahead. He tried the idea of going back, fully back, formally, with a salary and a role and his name on the work. and he let it sit in his chest and checked what it felt like. It felt like something that could be true. Not inevitable, not desperately wanted, not reluctant, just possible. A door that was open, rather than the 100 closed ones that had characterized the 6 years of careful, intentional retreat. He thought about whether he wanted to walk through it, and he found, to his own mild surprise, that the answer forming in him was not complicated, not dramatic, just quiet and clear, the way the best decisions were. The ones that had been waiting to be made and were only waiting for the right moment of honesty to become obvious. He wanted to work, not to prove something, not to recover what he'd walked away from, not even entirely for the specific pleasure of the craft, though the craft was real and the pleasure was real. He wanted to work because the week had shown him what working from the right place felt like. From a place of knowing who he was before he walked into the room, from a place of security that wasn't about the job title or the corner office or whose name went on the presentation, from a place where the work's quality was the thing that mattered, and everything else was secondary. He could do that now. He hadn't been able to do it 6 years ago because he hadn't known the difference yet between confidence and need, between building something good and needing someone to confirm it was good. He knew the difference now. The 6 years had taught him that. The grief had taught him that. The cleaning cart with the bad wheel pulling left down corridors of glass at 4:47 in the morning had taught him that, in the specific way that work done with full attention teaches you things that no amount of thinking about it could. He pulled out his phone on the corner of Kedzie and called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. "Yes," he said. A pause. "Yes?" "To the offer. The terms we discussed." He stopped at the light. "I want one modification." "What's the modification?" "I keep the Tuesday evenings. I have a drawing class." A beat of silence, and then something that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to it. The sound of someone who had been braced for a harder negotiation and gotten something unexpectedly human instead. "That's the modification," she said. "That's the modification." "Done," she said. "Tuesday evenings are yours." He put the phone in his pocket and crossed the street. The apartment was warm when he got home. He set his bag down on the chair by the door, the sketchbook inside it. Put the kettle on. Stood at the window while it heated and looked at the street below. Ordinary, mid-morning, a woman pushing a stroller, a delivery driver double-parked, 2 pigeons doing their pigeons things on the opposite sidewalk without any evident agenda. The tea was ready. He made it, brought it to the small table by the window, sat down. He thought about Darren Cross in that windowless room on the 35th floor. He didn't think about it with anger or with satisfaction. Both of those would have required him to be more invested in Darren's story than he was, and he wasn't. He thought about it in the way you think about a cautionary truth, that the opposite of building something was not failing to build it. The opposite of building something was building the conditions that prevented someone else from building it, which was a different kind of failure, and a worse one, because it knew what it was doing. You couldn't make yourself significant by making other people invisible. The attempt always turned on you eventually, the way it had turned on Darren, not because justice was predictable or the world was fair, but because a strategy built on obscuring competence rather than developing it had no foundation, and things without foundations did not hold up under pressure. That was the lesson that nobody printed in business school syllabi, but that every long career eventually taught. What you built that was real, that could be handed to a team and used, that could be pointed to and said, "This is why it works." That was the thing that lasted. Not the credit you claimed, not the room you controlled, not the person you edged out of a project by framing them as a threat. The work. Always the work. He drank his tea and looked at the street, and after a while he reached into his bag and took out the sketchbook and opened it to a blank page. He wasn't working on anything. There was no project, no brief, no problem to solve. Just the clean page, and the particular quality of late morning light coming through the window over the sink, and the small, uncomplicated pleasure of a man sitting at his kitchen table doing what he did because he had always done it, and would keep doing it whether or not anyone was watching. He picked up a pen and began to draw. Not for anyone. Not for Asterion or Harmon or Victoria's offer or the contract that would be formalized next week. Just for the same reason he had always done it, even in the years when he told himself he'd stopped. Because some things were not a choice. Some things were just what you were, patient as the lake and just as quiet, waiting for the morning when you were needed, and when that morning finally came, you simply did what you had always known how to do. You showed up. You did the work. You let it be enough.